The information density of your channel is drinking from a fire hose of mind-blowing facts.
The golden age of Army R&D has a lot of really interesting research we can parallel today and talk about later, but during this time, the Foreign Technology Division was trying to use recovered technology to use human brain waves to guide ICBM missiles.
Whoa!
It is not only possible, it is essential.
And then there's also stories about the 1983 Strategic Defense Initiative instituted by Ronald Reagan, which was to act against Soviet ICBMs.
Star Wars.
Yeah, this likely had a backdoor to fund UAP programs and act offensively against UAP. This technology is obviously not ubiquitous. There's different types of technology, there's different craft design. One could reasonably assume then there's different types of NHI, some manned, some not manned. That design actually was featured in the first ever episode of The X-Files, which was allegedly based on true stories from John D'Souza. It's the same design.
Wow. I'm here with Sammy, UAPGerb, who runs, I think, my favorite channel on YouTube that covers UFOs, literally. The information density of your channel is second to none. It's drinking from a fire hose of mind-blowing facts. Like, I think any 15-second clip from any one of your videos could beget its own entire video on various other channels that are kind of slower and less fast-paced. I'm just so impressed by you, and I'm grateful to call you a friend, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. We had another conversation, and it looks like that might go up on my WAP, this channel where we're trying to foster really cool kind of community engagement, have conversations that kind of take it to the next level when it comes to UFOs. But this follow-up should get crazier because the UFO world has gone nuts since we last spoke. So it's an honor to have you here, man.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm happy to be back. I mean, we recorded last time in November. Since then, we had the hearings. We had the Soul Foundation. We had Jake coming forward. We've had so much to touch on. So like you and I talked about, got this back together because a ton of new topics to touch on, old stuff to revisit, new information. It's been an exciting time.
It's been a crazy time. I don't even know where to start. Maybe we start with the Jake Barber story. Sure. So we're in unprecedented territory where we have somebody coming out, a UFO whistleblower, claiming firsthand knowledge, saying that he retrieved an egg-shaped craft, and then a video coming out that may have been a little hyped up and anticlimactic. Yeah. But if you listen to him, a lot of what he says is just extremely internally consistent with, people like Michael Herrera, who you've done a great piece on, and a lot of other accounts when it comes to, UFOs and crash retrievals. It kind of vindicates Stephen Greer as well. And so it's kind of hard to poke holes in actually just the core details of the story. But yeah, what's your take on this whole Jake Barber phenomena?
Well, to start, the video on the News Nation special isn't even that wasn't taken by Jake, and I think that was rather rushed and overhyped, just like you said. Dr. Nolan came out beforehand, said people will be very happy with this. I don't think anybody but was happy with that. But the whole Jake story for me goes back to investigating Michael Herrera. Way back in the day, I think this was February of 2024, I made a video on him and Jonathan Weygant. And anybody unfamiliar with Jonathan Weygant, he was a Lance Corporal in the Marines who claimed in 1997, while stationed in Peru under Operation Laser Strike, that he encountered a crashed UAP. Kind of large, egg-shaped, featured some ubiquitous features that we see in other retrievals.
Where's Operation Laser Strike?
Operation Laser Strike was an anti-narco operation in Peru. So there were ground-based radar systems from U.S. intelligence to track drug-running planes and so forth.
And what year was this?
97.
Okay.
And so Jonathan Weygant, Lance Corporal at the time, basically was sent to kind of investigate a crash of an unknown, possibly foreign craft. And he and two other Marines, one Sergeant Allen and another person, found a crashed craft. The story is super interesting because it features mother of pearl effect on the skin of the craft, liquid coming from the craft. Explain
what mother of pearl effect is.
Kind of like oil on water. Something that Jake and others also kind of described, unique features of the shimmering of kind of the craft skin. And also, Weygant spoke of what he assumed to be bodies in the craft with kind of an arm hanging out of the craft. He's only ever done 2 interviews, one in 2001 for Stephen Greer, one in 2023 under, I think, Dan Willis. And so he is a really interesting person.
Are you in touch with him?
Yes. Jonathan Weygant is one of the nicest people I've ever met in my entire life.
Wow.
He's a really good guy.
Do you find him beyond reproach as a person?
Yes, I fully believe Jonathan Weygandt's encounter.
Why?
There's small details that kind of prove to aid in other research. The reason I covered him and Michael together in a video, besides just the fact they were Marines, is they both talked about a team present. Of course, in Michael's case, he talked about a human-made craft that he encountered. But
let's back up real
Right.
quick. So you're saying Weygandt's this Peru case, and then just for the audience, Michael Herrera is this case in Indonesia with this Marine unit, right?
Yes.
And they see this sort of, I guess he calls it Vanta Black.
Yeah.
8-gon shape, which Jake Barber describes as well, craft hovering above the treetops. He kind of closes in on it, and then this like really elite paramilitary unit then basically takes his whole unit into sort of custody, and kind of reprimands them. And then he thinks that this whole thing is part of some sort of psionic asset trafficking scheme where UFO legacy programs are actually taking people in third world countries like Indonesia back to the U.S. in order to summon craft. I mean, the whole thing.
Well, initially he thought it was human trafficking. And,
Right.
and we'll get into this in a few minutes. It was when he gave his testimony, when Michael Herrera gave his testimony at the 2023 Stephen Greer National Press Club show, that's when Jake Barber was sitting in the audience and said, I know about this, and contacted Michael.
We back-channeled it. That was us. We back-channeled that.
That was
information.
you?
That was me.
Oh my God.
But in Michael and Jonathan's encounters, so Jonathan said he saw an extraterrestrial craft or a non-human intelligence craft. Michael has stated, unlike the Air report, which lies about this, that he saw a human-made craft. However, there are some similar elements in both aspects. The crash recovery team in Jonathan's story, some of them wore DOE-lettered rain jackets, and there were other seemingly military operators in black fatigues. They spoke with American dialect but featured no insignia. This was the same thing that Michael described. Michael described a little further by stating that these men back in 2009 had really advanced M4 rifles with, beautiful rangefinders and
They have bioscanners.
yeah, kind of like what he described to be like a modern cell phone to kind of scan their identification and so forth. And so there were some very similar elements, and that's kind of why I covered those two people together now.
And that's pretty wild, right? In 2000, and what was it?
2009. Yeah.
Yeah, that's like, pretty shortly after the iPhone was released. So do you have any sense of what these elite, paramilitary groups, like who they're working on behalf of? Is it UFO legacy programs, the Department of Energy? I know that's been speculated at times, or
I think they're two different teams, to be quite honest. Because Jonathan described a team of guys in camouflage with weapons, the black fatigue, DOE rain jackets, and also men in hazmat suits. So this must have been a specially designed crash retrieval team to contain biologics, spillage, possibly hazardous materials. If you analyze other cases in history, the 1974 Koyame alleged crash and some of the Majestic documents, there have been occasions where toxic elements have seeped from crash retrievals and so forth. But I think this is likely a DOE NEST team, nuclear emergency search teams. This is kind of a almost semi-private institutions. I mean, back in the day, these NEST teams, which were kind of elite operators sent to deal with anything that involved nuclear technology or nuclear secrets. This was comprised of various specialized operators and also received help from contractors like EG&G. We know EG&G from the Wilson Davis memo, from the story of Bob Lazar, Edgar Fouchet, so forth, seeped in UFO lore.
yes.
It seems like Michael, the team he was dealing with, is the same team that Jake Barber is familiar with. And this is like a deep, black, former JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, Tier 1 operators, former Delta, the SEAL Team 6, Intelligence Support Activity, 24th STS. And these guys are bad eggs who are okay with hurting people. Then this is likely strictly private teams.
And who does it roll up to? Because I was trying to talk to Jake about this, and it's like there's an ongoing FBI investigation, so he can't say much. And then I did get him to say, well, you could probably guess, if you had two guesses on the aerospace prime contractor front,
Can you say anything about the companies that you worked for in the context of these UFO crash retrievals?
Look, man, if you took two guesses, you'd get both of them right on the first try.
There you go.
Okay.
And then, so my guess is, this is me talking, would be like Lockheed and Northrop, but like, there's this other element of like Department of Energy, like who in the government does this roll up to? You hear stuff like the CIA's director of science and technology, you know, somebody like Glenn Gaffney would be involved. And back in the day, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence was probably involved in this sort of stuff. But who's in charge from the government perspective now?
Gosh, that's a great question. And I think it's probably a very small portion of people. I think, like you talked about, elements of DOE and intelligence, CIA, and I think even more so than CIA modern day, the National Security Agency, NSA.
Yep.
We know that the CIA deals with humans or human intelligence,
Yep.
and we know that NSA deals with SIGINT or signals intelligence. As far as why I also say the NSA, so in my projects, I use as much publicly available research as humanly possible. I don't really like to say, well, a source told me this, a source told me this, even though there's, you know, quite a bit of people I talk to that, you know, will never make it on a video or never reveal their identity public. But this individual was in U.S. Army Office of Public Affairs. He served in the mid-2010s, and he said, I'm not really afraid of the CIA, but what I'm terrified of is the NSA. So I think if I had to wager, it'd be elements of the NSA pulling a lot of strings.
Well, the sort of public-facing review group, you know, the All-Domain Anomalies, you know, Anomalous Research Organization or Office, or I always screw it up.
Organization, one of them.
Whatever. You know, the main sort of outfit studying UFOs from a public, you know, perspective. The new director was a former director of the National Security Administration, the NSA, John Kozlowski. And so it does beg this question, you know, how much of this is you know, I often think that the overrated elements of UFOs are just focused on like metamaterials. Yeah. You know, that's like the tip of the iceberg. Yeah. And then actually it's this way deeper sort of thing around like human, like signal, like the fact that we're like probably getting downloads and stuff. And actually there's a book called Above Black by a guy named Dan Sherman. And he's like sort of recruited into this like nondescript, you know, NSA building. And I've heard from an extremely credible source high up in government, where if I were to give you this person's title, it's just completely beyond reproach, saying that program probably existed. He recruited to this like NSA, you know, nondescript building, and basically told to do all sorts of weird mind matter experiments, like collapse a sine wave. He's given these like binaural beats, and then like basically he's used as like a sort of, you know, human antenna for like alien signals. Right. And it's part of this thing he calls Project Preserve Destiny. And he says that he's genetically been manipulated in the womb. And more, I interviewed yesterday a psionic asset who was recruited through the GATE program, through these gifted student programs or whatever. And so I think more and more is coming out of the woodwork around like kids and gifted people and like clairvoyance being approached at a very young age for downloads and signals that they're getting. And there's a guy named Andrei Puharich who, I believe he wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom. And he had these space kids back in the day where he'd recruit all these kids to upstate New York. And he had this Round Table Institute in Maine. And it was the space kids were meant to basically get downloads from, and Star Trek came from one of these downloads. Wow. Gene Roddenberry was inspired by this woman named Phyllis Schliemann. I don't know, Phyllis something. Yeah. And that sort of inspired all of Star Trek. And EG&G, I think, actually picked up a lot of the work there. And so it's super fascinating.
That's similar to like Tim Taylor, right? He said some of the ideas for his businesses came via like unknown downloads to his head. Isn't that what Diana Pasulka has kind of said around him and his work? Yeah,
that he engaged in protocols to basically download all sorts of information. And you know, he I believe started a biotech company called Vivex Biotech and sold it for $88 million or something crazy like that. And he claims that a lot of that was derived from downloads that he got. And I spoke to him for a very brief period of time over the phone once. He sort of disappeared on me after that. And, you know, his whole thing was like, you know, don't use your phone and tap in and like, you know, and it all felt like, on the one hand, cliche, but maybe actually really fundamental, important advice as far as, you know, being able to gain access to, you know, better stuff or whatever from I don't know. The whole thing's really trippy.
Well, it's been an interesting year so far, right? With all kind of the mention of psionics. I mean, I'm sure I speak for a lot of people when I speak for myself here. I don't really like to use the word nuts and bolts. I think it's super cliche and overplayed, but kind of my focus is in legacy program research, crash retrieval, reverse engineering, stuff like that. So the whole psionics territory with Jake and stuff is still uncomfortable territory for me, but there's still so many lines of research and stuff I do that harken back to this. One example is Philip J. Corso. I recently did a project on Corso. Corso stated that in 1960, he was recruited to the U.S. Army's Foreign Technology Division. This isn't to be confused with the Air Force's Foreign Technology Division. Two separate things. Under Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau. Now, the Foreign Technology Division, there's no records of it. It's similar to the Army's Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit that probably only exists through institutional record. Right. There's no record. But in Corso's testimony...
Which, by the way, we know that existed.
Correct, yeah.
That was Interplanetary Phenomena Unit. We know that existed, yes. Which is crazy. We knew that a group named that existed between, 47 and 50 or something?
Yeah, 47 to 50. And that was first confirmed in 1986 to UFO researcher William Steinman.
Exactly.
And in the Majestic documents, there's an IPU report, Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit report, and an IPU field order. Two documents, still disputed, but...
So those are disputed, but the Steinman thing, I believe Steinman contacted somebody in the federal government to gain more access, and they basically said the records had been deleted.
Yeah, and that it only existed in institutional memory.
That's right, but it existed. Mm-hmm. And so that's just so fascinating.
And I'll get back to Corso, but maybe we'll talk about the IPU documents later, because that actually talks about like a crash retrieval that killed technicians at Sandia National Labs because of the danger of the crash. But so Corso worked for the Foreign Technology Division. This is not in dispute. You can look through his official military records that said he was the chief of the Foreign Technology Division, not out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But the crux of his testimony is that under Arthur Trudeau in 1958 to 1962, we saw the golden age of Army R&D. And this is where materials recovered from the Roswell crash and possibly other crashes, maybe Aztec, maybe crash at Corona, plains of San Agustin, so forth, that the U.S. Army would partner with the U.S. industry to figure out how these technologies work and seed them back primarily to help the U.S. military, and secondly, help the American people if necessary. Well, we know we never saw the American people if necessary, but it wasn't just to seed the technologies, it was also to improve upon existing technologies. There's a lot of contention here because some of these technologies were passive night vision systems, and guys like Colonel John B. Alexander, who has made some lies about the Majestic documents before, dispute this, and stuff like the transistor and integrated circuit. But I like to focus on other stuff because the golden age of Army R&D has a lot of really interesting research we can parallel today and talk about later. But Corso also states during this time that the Foreign Technology Division was trying to use recovered technology to use human brain waves to guide ICBM missiles and ballistic missiles.
Yeah. Really?
Yeah.
In today's world, staying informed can feel like navigating a maze of headlines, each with its own agenda. That's why I started using Ground News, a tool designed for skeptics and truth seekers like many in this community. It's an app and website created by a former NASA engineer to tackle a problem we all face: how the way we consume information can distort our understanding of the world. Ground News brings transparency to the news. It gathers coverage from over 50,000 sources worldwide, organizes stories by topic, and even breaks down the bias and ownership behind each perspective. With features like the bias distribution bar and factuality score, it's easy to see how different outlets frame the same story. For example, when I was researching those mysterious drone sightings, Ground News gave me instant access to over 200 articles, helping me uncover every angle, from the facts to the spin. For the left, from Radar Online, Donald Trump says, shoot them down. But on the right, news refers to it as a rogue loose nuke. This just goes to show how different the framing can be based on where you're reading it. So if you're tired of echo chambers and one-sided narratives, Ground News is your ultimate tool for staying informed and making better decisions. You can even follow your favorite topics and compare coverage to find the most credible sources. And for a limited time, you can get the same plan I use every day for nearly half the price.
Just go to ground.news/Jesse Michels.
Or scan this QR code to save 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan. Or gift it to someone you know and have more informed discussions and hopefully chill out about those drones. I only promote brands I vet, and I think you'll find them just as valuable as I do. Ground News, the truth is out there. You just need the right tools to find it. Today, I want to share something that's become a game changer for me personally, Qualia Senolytic. Have you ever heard about senolytics? It's a revolutionary class of ingredients that researchers discovered less than a decade ago, and they're already being hailed as one of the biggest breakthroughs in promoting healthy aging. This is where Qualia Senolytic shines. As we age, our bodies accumulate what scientists call senescent cells, also known as zombie cells. These cells just sit there, hogging resources and dragging down your energy, recovery, and even mental clarity. Think of it like pruning a plant. You've got to remove the dead leaves to get the rest to thrive. Since I started taking Qualia Senolytic, I've felt a huge boost in energy and productivity. I'm sharper, more focused, and genuinely feel like I've rolled the clock back. And here's the kicker. You only need to take it 2 days a month. This science-backed formula is non-GMO, vegan, and designed to work synergistically to help your body shed those zombie cells. And with a 100-day money-back guarantee, there's zero risk in trying it out for yourself. So resist aging at the cellular level and try Qualia Senolytic. Go to qualialife.com/Jesse for up to 50% off and use code Jesse at checkout for an additional 15% off. For your convenience, Qualia Senolytic is also available at select GNC locations near you. That's QUALIA life.com/Jesse for an extra 15% off your purchase. Thanks so much to Qualia for sponsoring today's episode.
That is so interesting. I didn't know he said that.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So this is Philip J. Corso wrote this book called The Day After Roswell, and he wrote it in 97?
97, but The Day After Roswell has a bunch of fluff added by its co-writer.
That's interesting. And he wasn't super happy about that, right?
No. Rumor has it he only had 24 hours to edit it, and according to his son, he put his hand to his head and said, I can't believe this.
That's so interesting, because I was just talking to James Fox, who has an interview with Philip J. Corso, and we need to put this out. It's not public.
No, it is. It is.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
He said he's sitting on 3 hours, and maybe
only
part
20
of
minutes
I
is
think
published.
a little bit's public.
And it's published through Greer, weirdly enough.
Yeah. No, so I think more can come out. And he was like, basically James Fox said, gun to my head, I get shot if I'm wrong. I think Philip J. Corso was legit. Mm-hmm. And so that's fascinating. He had a co-writer that might have kind of co-opted his process in some way, because there is stuff in that book that's, I think, clearly false.
Yeah.
Like if you look at the tech tree around integrated circuits and semiconductors, I don't think you need alien intervention to describe. There's I think a Munich patent on a transistor that goes back to the 30s.
Yeah.
But I do think we saw this stepwise leap in, interesting technology around this time, especially in material science. And I do believe the basic Roswell story, that some sort of, this memory metal, and I believe Jesse Marcel, this Air Force flight surgeon, that may have handled this memory metal material, and that it probably did make its way to Wright Airfield at the time, which Wright Airfield would have been the place you would have taken it, because they were basically reverse engineering adversary tech. They had
MiGs, Russian MiGs later on, but
in 1943 they successfully reverse engineered a German pulse jet engine. So they were already successfully reverse engineering adversary retrieved technology. So it makes total sense that you'd take something there. And then basically to complete the loop on Philip J. Corso, he says that material is taken to Roscoe Hillenkoetter. Roscoe Hillenkoetter is the first director of the CIA, makes the call that Corso should be in charge of doling this out to basically civil side use cases, for commercial purposes. So Bell Labs would be the main place.
Bell Labs, Sperry Rand, which went defunct, and its divisions went to Northrop, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and others. And so Philip Corso actually has a manuscript. It's called Dawn of a New Age. And so for my research on Corso, I read the two side by side and went through every single difference. Remarkably different. For example, in Day After Roswell, there's a passage about how Corso intimidated a CIA director to off himself, which is absurd. And of course, you don't see that in the manuscript.
Oh, they psyoped him, man. Yeah. And he had 24 hours to edit it.
Yeah.
But what else?
The first chapter of the book is like a detailed description of Roswell as if somebody was there. Corso never talks about that stuff. He doesn't know what happened at Roswell. He just takes the materials he's seen. Another example is continued mentions to the Majestic documents in Day After Roswell. They're only passively referenced once in Dawn of a New Age. However, in Dawn of a New Age, Corso also states interesting stuff that he found after his time in the Foreign Technology Division. And maybe we'll get into that later because we can circle back to the psionic stuff with other like really old research we can dig into. But, Corso would talk about stuff like a UFO working group, which there's reason to suggest maybe the Majestic 12 changed into that along the way. But what I wanted to say about the psionics as well is, and just kind of the mental phenomena, I want to route this back to 3 key players, Dr. Eric A. Walker, Dr. Robert Sarbacher, and Wilbert B. Smith. So this story takes place around 1950. Wilbert B. Smith was a Canadian radio engineer who had a huge interest in flying saucers after reading The Flying Saucer Conspiracy by author Frank Scully. Dr. Robert Sarbacher was the scientific advisor to the Research and Development Board spearheaded by Vannevar Bush. Around 1950, Wilbert Smith met with Robert Sarbacher to talk about flying saucers because the Canadian government wanted to use sort of the Earth's magnetic field for propulsion. And he thought after reading The Flying Saucer Conspiracy, there may be some sort of connection. And during this meeting, Robert Sarbacher said stuff like, well, in the 1950, there were meetings about flying saucers. The U.S. government studies them. It's spearheaded by a group of Vannevar Bush. I can't tell you what they're from or what they're made of, but we know they're not made by humans. And so Wilbert Smith relayed that in a 1950 Department of Transportation Canada memo that was then reduced from top secret to, I think, restricted access or confidential in 1960 something, and then completely unclassified later. But so Wilbert B. Smith took that and met with Sarbacher and these guys again to really get involved with UFOs. And Sarbacher basically said, I can connect you to the proper American authorities to engage with more UFO research if you can A, become cleared, and B, give something back. And so Wilbert B. Smith, he would later on go to spearhead Project Magnet, which was Canada's first UFO investigation group, followed up by Project Second Story. But when he finally met again with the Americans, he learned other things such as, Vannevar Bush spearheaded the group. He knew that, a couple more things, but he also said that the U.S. authorities studying UFOs were obsessed with the mental phenomena that accompanied UFO research. So later on down the line, there was also a gentleman, Dr. Eric A. Walker. This guy is super esteemed. He was Penn State University's president, one of the smartest people of the entire 20th century. He was named in a conversation to William Steinman, UFO researcher, that one of the attendees of these meetings in the 1950s about UFO crash retrievals was Dr. Eric A. Walker. Dr. Eric A. Walker would stay silent for a long time. He was first contacted in, I think, 1984 by William Steinman. He returned William Steinman's letter really cryptically with a typed thing saying like, go, leave me alone. But eventually he would kind of meet with Steinman and another researcher named Henry Azadehel. During these meetings, he would say some interesting stuff like he was present at the 1965 Kecksburg UFO crash. And yes, that he did attend these meetings, but when William Steinman asked him about, or maybe it was Henry Azadehel, asked him about Majestic 12, he said he knew about Majestic 12, he'd known about them for 40 years. And he retorted with a question saying, what do you know about ESP, extrasensory perception? Unless you know about it.
I think he said the sixth sense specifically.
Yeah. You would never be let in.
Yes. So, well, it was almost, not only you'd never be let in, like you can't even comprehend the reality of it. It was, and I think it was a Don Quixote reference,
chasing after windmills.
Chasing after windmills, which that's always stuck with me. It's like disclosure isn't this file that you can just give to somebody. No. It's like, I can't even tell you because you're literally like unable to cognize what I might be able to, share. Yeah. It's just so fascinating. And then just to add corroboration to the first thing you were mentioning with the Sarbacher Wilbert Smith connection, not only did he run research and development under Vannevar Bush, he was head of Washington National Labs. Yeah. He was this like atomic energy expert at the highest level in the U.S. and he was kind of scrubbed. This is Robert Sarbacher. He was kind of scrubbed from the internet as well, and he was known for having like an IQ of 200 plus or something. Just brilliant guy. And so he's just this fascinating character who is also very close with Thomas Townsend Brown, who's this anti-gravity inventor at the time. You know
better than anybody.
Well, in 1956, when Thomas Townsend Brown does his experiment in Paris proving the Byfield-Brown effect and that this works in a vacuum, and I think, showing some sort of interesting coupling between electromagnetism and gravity. He comes back to the U.S. and he's picked up in a black Cadillac by Robert Sarbacher, who he's very, very close to. And so there's a lot of, connection there. And so you had a third. So Eric Walker, Robert Sarbacher, both corroboration for this sort of ESP psionic thing. What else?
And then another thing, I'm sure many viewers will know Leonard Stringfield, who's one of the greatest crash retrieval researchers, probably the greatest of all time. In the 70s and 80s, when nobody was doing this, he was researching crash retrievals. He was mainly focusing on witness testimony. In his files, so in crash retrieval status reports 1 through 7, as well as when he passed on and Michael Schratt went to his archives in Cincinnati and read through the rest of his reports, he found numerous mentions of witnesses who had observed recovered UFOs and kind of cutaway diagrams accompanying the UFOs, and how in certain retrieval cases there would seem to be like a headband or a headband transceiver worn by the operators of the craft that somehow would pilot said craft. And that the same thing Corso said, right? In interviews with him, he said that the operators of specifically the Roswell craft were part of the guidance system. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't seem too far-fetched when Jake talks about an asset, a psionic person being able to use their mind to commandeer the flight controls of a craft.
When we look at collecting data, one of the areas that we look to collect data is through a psionic asset, which is an individual who's trained in remote viewing, psychic abilities, telekinesis, that type of thing.
I'm still unfamiliar with the physics of really how to wrap my head around this fully, but it's not out of the question to me. It's based in a lot of research spanning back to 1960s.
Yeah. No, I think it's the future of physics, and I think it's just so like when you have an anomaly in physics, if you can't turn it into math and you can't instrumentalize it into technology, I think it goes into this category called an anomaly, and you just don't know what to do with it. And then the anomaly usually or often will get vindicated in a new theory. But until that anomaly gets vindicated in a new theory, you just have to say it's a weird anomaly and we don't know what to do with it. And so parapsychology, I think, is, parapsychology being the psionic sort of mind matter thing, is proven experimentally.
Right.
You can't turn it into math. We're in the Stone Age on it, and it's hard to turn into technology. Maybe inside, government circles have turned this into technology, but we haven't civil side. And so I think because of that, it's totally stigmatized. But if you look at other examples in the past, like black body radiation, in the 1860s, or the orbit of Mercury, which was not described well in a Newtonian paradigm. You needed Einstein to describe it. Until you get the new theory, you just don't get vindication for the anomaly. And so that's my take on it. Now, it's not like physics outside of that branch has been productive at all in the last 70 years. Like it's actually been extremely unproductive.
Well, who knows what sort of progress has been made that's been kind of kept under wraps. We have SRI and SAIC with the Stargate program. And you and I have personal experience with Randy, who, as a Green Beret, was at the Naval Surface Warfare Center Crane, went underground via contractor SAIC, and was shown technology that purportedly responded to human consciousness.
We get under there, door opens, we go through a security type checkpoint. I remember the first thing that stood out to me was that it was significantly more modern than everything up top. Yep. And that was odd.
Now, anybody who's saying that the Navy hasn't studied this stuff is not fully knowledgeable on the subject. Going back to 2011 and 2012, the Navy, the ONR specifically, Office of Naval Research, was publishing studies on a sixth sense within humans. So the Navy, SAIC, SRI, Stargate, all of these guys are pretty interested. I mean, we have U.S. Army INSCOM General Albert Stubblebine, who wanted to basically cognitively enhance soldiers. The movie The Men Who Stare at Goats is made after Stubblebine.
Yeah, after Stubblebine, Lynn Buchanan, and all the whole Stargate program, which ran from 1972 to 95, and systematically, kind of employed these psychic spies, which would gather intel, which was hugely consequential for the United States. I just interviewed actually Joseph McMoneagle, who figured out this, novel Russian submarine, I think in 78 or 79. And that was extremely critical for, the U.S. during the Cold War. And he was thanked at like the highest level. I think Robert Baker actually was like sort of very against his intel to begin with, and then he realized that it was sort of vindicated after McMoneagle sort of figured this out, and he won the Legion of Merit due to the very productive activity he engaged in. So I do think the Office of Naval Intelligence is the oldest intelligence organization in the U.S.
Right.
It goes back to the 1890s, way pre National Security Act and CIA and NSA later, like pre all of that. So. I agree. And for the audience, because they're probably drinking from a fire hose of facts right now, Randy Anderson is this amazing Green Beret who you introduced me to, who is really just I think a war hero. I think both you and I have heard offline of stories around his deployments to various countries that he wants to lay low on because it's not the Green Beret way. He doesn't want to brag about anything.
It's not the SEAL way.
But there's a number of people in his graduating class who've died. He's gone through a lot, and he was stationed he was an 18 Bravo weapons sergeant, an expert on all various weapon systems, and he was taken underground to this deep underground military base, which we know exists across the country.
It's not a question.
Yeah,
that's not a question, and that's a fascinating topic to get into as well. And once you talk about Randy, we can absolutely get into dumbs.
Well, I just want to hear you because I got a lot of flack for that video, and I've spoken to his colleagues. I've spoken to two of his Green Beret buddies now.
Yeah,
I have their DD-214s. I know a little bit about them and their background, and I know that Randy is not lying. No. And there are people out there on the internet questioning his service, which is insane and I honestly shameful.
Yeah.
If there's anything substantive you have to say there or on the testimony, fine.
Because he also has pictures of him at Crane.
It's absurd.
At the year, right when he saw the technology as well.
He's a war hero.
Yeah.
And you just don't, that's insane. And then, there are questions he has about his experience.
Yeah.
The Off-World Technologies division, like he doesn't know what that was. That human technology was that non-human intelligence, tech.
After that, we moved on down another hallway and got into an area that had a marking on the wall and said "off-world technology."
It said "off-world technology."
That was where the weird shit started. We go into the room, and the one room, these significantly higher level of technology, like the lighting even looked, everything was just, it was more, it was just a different vibe, man. I don't know how else to describe it. Like I said, the lighting was different. The walls had maybe, I would assume, some type of Faraday material. Everything was just a higher level of detail. Yeah. The first object was a metallic basketball-sized sphere, and it was above a podium, and it looked like it was just levitating above the podium.
Levitating above the podium.
What makes you think that was non-human?
Well, I don't think it's a valid criticism as well to say that because there was some sort of sign that labeled Off-World Technologies Division that's completely nonsensical.
Yeah,
his story. I've seen that criticism leveraged around, and how do you that's quite a baseless claim to make that a division would not be named. Sure, it may seem a bit strange, but we're talking about UFO legacy programs and deep underground military bases that span the continental United States. So that's not an accurate criticism to me. But the technologies Randy saw, I want to focus specifically on the sphere that he said reacted to human consciousness. There is a mutual friend of ours that has observed that as well.
Yes.
And that is Jordan of Skywatchers, if we can talk about that.
Yeah.
When he was involved in the GATE program as a late teen, intelligence or military brass and suits and eggheads brought in a case, opened it up, and there was the same exact sphere.
That story continues to pop up.
Yeah.
It's either a sphere or a piece of metal, and they want to see. I just interviewed somebody yesterday, and I can talk about this because it's going to come out. This guy Shane Frakes, Old Vet Symposium on Twitter, and he talks about being shown a sphere. And so it's the same thing, shown a sphere and seeing how the person would react and if they have some sort of psionic connection to it. And it's kind of the same thing as the Jake Barber story, where he locks on mentally to, in this case, the Akon craft. But there is a mental connection. And so that is, and then there's SAIC, I believe, is on record studying quote unquote psychotronic technology.
Yeah,
there's like a long history.
They coined their own terms for like telekinesis and psychokinesis when they kind of bought up the research from SRI. So SAIC took it and ran with it.
And they were operating Stargate, the psychic spy program, in Palo Alto, like at the end of its existence. So yeah, there's a lot of history there that just corroborates, where if you don't know the history, you're going to hear this Green Beret saying, I saw a sphere levitating in front of a podium and I mentally locked onto it. And you're going to be like, that's fucking crazy.
Yeah.
But you need to update your priors and like actually dive deep into the history of this stuff, which, I mean, you're like the tip of the spear on, but I often feel like I'm out on an island where you have very few people to talk to who who don't realize that this stuff actually isn't crazy. If you're engaging in solid Bayesian reasoning, maybe you have to think probabilistically, and it's not 100%. This is definitely real or whatever. But like, your base case is that it actually is real because there's a lot of evidence around it.
Yeah, and like the other testimonies we mentioned too are incredibly interesting. The story with Jordan, he and I spoke about that long before any research with Randy was ever made public. So initially, when I made contact with Randy, I went around kind of looking for any other story that may involve some sort of sphere, some sort of basketball-sized metal that might interact with people. And this also like almost harkens back even to how we opened up with the story of Jonathan Weygandt when he got in close proximity to the crash craft he saw, whether it was the beans or the craft itself. He felt an overwhelming sense of calmness and communication in his head. And we hear that from Jake Barber as well with the 8-gon.
You hear it in pretty much every alien abduction account as this sort of mental telepathic connection. And I do find it interesting. Certain people are down for like breaking exotic breaking physics in the form of exotic flight principles and like metamaterials. But for whatever reason, so that like breaks our reality there. But they're not down for the mental thing. And it's like, why is that a bridge too far? If you've crossed this bridge is crazy. So you have to open up, all possibilities at that point. And again, think probabilistically. So maybe that second bridge is slightly lower probability than the first bridge. But I think people don't realize just how limited their thinking is around a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's like what we talked about. Like my research mainly focuses on legacy programs, but I can't discount the research done at Stargate, the psionics stuff. I can't leave that out of the equation. I still need to study it always when it arises.
Of course, yeah.
And, and sometimes those bleed over into the realms I study as well. Because, we were talking about Stubblebine, who was interested in psychic spies. Then on the other hand, Stubblebine also has really interesting research into like UFO crash retrieval and legacy reverse engineering programs. Yep. So on one hand, he's kind of engaging with the more psychic aspect of the phenomenon. On the other hand, he's dealing with the really tangible program level stuff. I mean, Stubblebine created the U.S. Army INSCOM Intelligence and Security Command's Special Operations Unit, the Intelligence Support Activity. In, I think, 2002, right around the time the CIA OGA was created, the Intelligence Support Activity, which is a really, really like clandestine, secretive combat group, kind of like the CIA soldiers almost, was brought over to JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command. And if we adhere to some excellent reporting by Chris Sharp and others, the CIA OGA and its creation in 2002 and JSOC are utilized to perform crash retrievals and so forth.
Yeah. There's JSOC continues to come up, as like they sort of go in, and what's the connection between Delta Force and JSOC? Is there
Delta Force is a unit in JSOC. I think it's the 24th STS out of the Air Force, SEAL Team 6 out of the Navy, Delta out of Army, and ISA out of Army as well. There might be another unit or two. I don't want to butcher that, but those are some of the primary units.
And my buddy Matt Pines made the connection that Lou Elizondo is actually part of this group called Gray Fox.
Yeah.
Which is, deep military intelligence, but specifically it's like going into extremely sensitive sites, for JSOC.
Yeah.
And so, he might know a thing or two about UFOs from that, not just the OSAP ATIP, whatever that experience was around 2007, 2012. So
absolutely. And another interesting thing about Stubblebine, while we're talking about him, in the memoir Dawn of a New Age by Philip J. Corso stated he learned that in 1986, there was a group created called the UFO Working Group, which was created to study and kind of manipulate UFOs, reverse engineering, and so forth. And this was funded by the leader of U.S. Army INSCOM, which is, of course, Albert Stubblebine. And to top things off, to make it even more interesting, so that's 1986. In 1984, Stubblebine left the U.S. Army. He then went on to serve as like a chairman or a board member of BDM, which was a defense contractor bought up by TRW, which was then bought up by Northrop Grumman. But in 1985, Albert Stubblebine and BDM at their corporate headquarters in McLean, Virginia, created what they called the Advanced Theoretical Working Group.
Yes.
Which was a large which was a large event classified with DOE controls to study UFO reverse engineering and crash retrieval. And we have the famous notes by Oak Shannon, which resulted from that.
Okie Shannon, who was a Los Alamos project manager, very high up. You had, I believe, like Ferris Williams, Kenneth Shoulders,
John B. Alexander,
John B. Alexander, Hal Puthoff, guys like that. Was Eric Davis part of this, or
I don't know,
later?
but I wouldn't be surprised. He's always popping up in the same circle.
Well, it was clearly this sort of working group to figure out like the physics around UFOs, and I think, according to Okie Shannon, there were some even spookier people who would never speak, and they just sit in the room and they'd sort of gather intelligence on this stuff. And then when Greer started his kind of whistleblowing efforts, where he started to attract, this is Stephen Greer, Dr. Stephen Greer, started to attract all these people coming out of the government and speaking to him. And he starts to promote this sort of CE5, like, you know, getting into contact with the UFOs, attracting them, whatever. Stubblebine and John Alexander show up around him, and I believe Stubblebine offers him a big sum of money to like join legacy efforts or like join the program or something. Or what's the story there?
So I think because of Greer's own ego, and like I have my feelings about Greer, both pros and cons, he likes to frame this as Stubblebine offered me $2 billion to shut up and talk about UFOs. But I think, according to documents and emails on the DPI archive, that $2 billion, which still is an egregious sum of money, was to purchase Stephen Greer's institution, CSETI, and integrate it into Stubblebine's work. So it wasn't just to buy off Stephen Greer. It was to basically purchase his whole institution, and this was in 1992.
That's crazy. So what do you think was so valuable about what Stephen Greer was doing in 1992 that would, I mean, maybe that was a fake offer or like...
Well, I don't know if that's real, but the real meat of the Greer saga and the Greer information starts to pick up around 97. It's really hard to track down what Greer was doing in pre-1997.
But he was a doctor?
Yeah, he was a practicing trauma doctor, I think at an ER. I don't really know how he got interested in the subject, but he does say at the age of 18, and he said this in his 2024 September event, that he was contacted by like a cosmic intelligence and told to basically save the world.
He's brought a lot of exposure to the UFO world, and he should be really vindicated, and he's worked his ass off. But yeah, he can be weird vibes, I think, at times.
I think there was a really big shift in Greer. So... he talks about his archive release, the DPI archive, Disclosure Project Initiative Archives. He says it would take somebody 2 to 4 years to go through it. That's nonsense. I've gone through the whole thing like 8 times. But so in 1997, I don't know what Greer was doing before that.
Yeah.
But in 1997, UFO researcher William Hamilton III, who wrote the book Cosmic Top Secret I talked about in relation to Northrop Grumman, he had been in contact with Greer, and this UFO researcher, who I think is one of the most underappreciated people in the entire realm, he introduced Greer to various witnesses that would feature on the 2001 Disclosure Project National Press Club event, where various government and private sector whistleblowers would speak. Some of these included some redacted names who I've come to learn about those people. They're not public.
Wow.
And then Mark McCandlish and Brad Sorensen.
Oh, yeah.
The two primary witnesses, Brad Sorensen being the primary witness of the 1988 Norton Air Force show, where an alien reproduction vehicle was shown off, and Mark McCandlish, the person who created the line art drawings and so forth. And by the way, the term alien reproduction vehicle that most people associate with Greer was coined by Sorensen himself and relayed in Hamilton's 1992 book, Cosmic Top Secret. He got this wrong. He said alien replicated vehicle, but even so. And around the same time, I talked about this in around Northrop as well, Greer met a person named A.H. He's since spilled the name in his archive. I just won't repeat it. We'll call it A.H. But A.H. was, I guess, a former Boeing technician. And we can see from Hamilton and A.H. most of the grounds that Greer operates on today, including naming sites where programs operated, where it's Air Force Base, not really Wright-Patterson, China Lake, Dugway Proving Grounds, all of these sites. And you can see direct quotes from A.H. and Hamilton that have made it their way into Greer's research. He still is used today. I mean, Greer's a big proprietor that Dugway Proving Grounds out in Utah. Saw a lot of UFO programs shipped over from Area 51. And he always quotes that 35 to 40% of programs at Area 51 were moved to Dugway in Utah. Well, if you look at AH's testimony in the year 2000 recorded, he says the exact same thing. So Greer has really built upon, like most of us, like all of us, he stood on the shoulders of giants and important people before him. But there seemed to be a real shift when he gained that sort of popularity where Greer would really, really focus on the CE5 stuff, which can really rub people the wrong way. And I think that's really mostly due to kind of the monetary incentive around it. Like he's doing CE5 cruises.
And what is CE5 sort of summoning?
It's psionic stuff.
Psionic stuff, yeah.
But I think a little more spiritual, like more focus on love and light.
Yep.
And Greer's also been busted for posting photos of like cactuses and stuff and saying they're entities.
Yeah, it's this mixed bag, and it's somewhat unfortunate. But you have to express your sort of gratitude to him, but then it's also like sometimes you wish it came in better form.
Yeah, because
Uh-uh.
I've never spoken to Greer. I've never been in contact with him. I don't plan to, but I've been badmouthed by him. I know that.
What did he say about you?
So when Greer released his DPI archive, and I went through that and looked at all the accompanying files, because with each witness ID that's redacted, a lot of the time there's emails. I would look through these and I would say, like, why does Greer get to talk to these people and nobody else does? So I would spend weeks tracking people down and finding out who they were and contacting them. There've been multiple that I have, but at the tail end of 2024, there was a recent entry on the archive. This was a brand new person. This was the Army Public Affairs person that I talked about recently. I contacted this person. We struck up a relationship. This guy's an amazing person. But right when we started talking, he was suspicious of my motives, of course, because I reach out and I just said, hi, I found your name this way, this way, this way. Because whenever I reach out to somebody from the archive, I say, hey, this is where the breach of security happened. This is how I found your name. It will not be shared. I'm not interested in contacting anybody else. But so this guy and I started talking, and we hung up on the phone one day, and he called me back 10 minutes later. He said, I need to know what you're doing. I said, excuse me? He said, I just talked to Greer, and he said you're an intelligence asset. I said, what? So apparently this guy, when we hung up off the phone, he then contacted Greer because he was still in contact with Greer. And he gave Greer my full name, which I would prefer if he wouldn't have done that, but that's okay. And then Greer said I was an intelligence asset. So that's my one.
And then he said you were not an intelligence. He cleared it up, or he said you were an intelligence.
No,
asset.
Greer said I was an intelligence asset.
What is he basing that on?
Nothing.
He's just fucking saying that you're an intelligence.
Yeah, I've never talked to the guy.
Yeah. And for the record, on record, you'll say you don't have a security clearance.
No, I don't have a security clearance.
Yeah.
I've never been in the military. I've never been in intelligence.
Yeah.
Graduated with a degree in engineering, and I moved to.
What do you do? Do you have like a day job, or is YouTube your full time?
Yeah,
thing?
like mechanical engineering, service engineering. It's very boring. I'd like to move to this more full time because
for what can you say?
Medical devices, formerly renewable energy like wind turbines and such.
Okay. Normal dude.
Yeah, normal dude. But that's been my.
But he's gonna have a massive channel and do this full time, and
I hope so. I mean, there's a lot of work in this subject that I think needs to be revisited, because as much as I hate to say it, and I'm sure you realize it as well, there has been elements of circular reporting in this subject.
Tons, and I'm sure I've been guilty of it at times. Like I don't think you can thoroughly investigate all of this stuff and get it's all so crazy and weird. You're gonna get a little bit wrong along the way, and so it's gonna be this dialectical process where you have to wade through the bullshit and just have open conversations. And I think as long as people think you're a good faith actor and you're like earnestly showing your thought process to everybody and you're like getting closer to an approximation of truth, that's all you can do.
Yeah.
And then just saying, like, admitting if you're wrong, and like if somebody comes at you with something substantive, just like accepting that and incorporating it into your worldview. And I think the other tricky thing is like people can say when you cover this topic that you are shilling a thing, and you can be grifting, which is absurd. Like I do have like a company that like encapsulates my show. I've never taken money out of the company. Like I've never money has come in through like sponsors and that sort of thing, because I do want this to be sustainable. I have costs, and like I'm down to make money on it long term. But like what I was doing before was definitely more of a clear path to making like a lot of money than this. If anything, I've lost a lot of money over the last couple of years. It's kind of funny. Like, but yeah, I don't think you can do anything else other than like earnestly kind of move forward and just be humble and cool. And like people sense that. And
yeah,
you know,
I really, from what I try and do, I see a big gap in modern day in terms of investigating primarily legacy programs and witness testimony. Because historically, like wherever you look in this subject, Greer kind of has his pause in post like 1995, because even he is entwined in stuff like the Wilson Davis memo going back that far and so forth. And guys like really great researchers today, like Richard Dolan, he still focuses more on like sightings and kind of flaps and encounters and so forth. And what he does, he's almost the best at.
Totally. Well, that's the beautiful thing about this subject is I don't view it as zero sum at all. Like I actually think you're like best in the world now, and you will be like so much better there because how old are you? You're like
28.
You're 28.
Yeah, 28.
Yeah. So it's like you're like best in the world now, like tracking granular like legacy activity stuff. I think I'm really good on the theory side.
Absolutely.
Like you know, like consilience, interdomain consilience between like science and like theory and that sort of thing. And that's what I love. And then, you know, we have a buddy, Chris Ramsey, who has his YouTube channel, who like, to me, I think he's going to have like the biggest YouTube channel on this just because his like the thoughtfulness that he puts into like production and storytelling is just next level. And his skill set there is so good that he's going to open this topic up to like a whole new massive, you know, a swath of people. And I think we're all like pretty like, I don't know, we all have egos, but we're pretty like team players, like, you know? And so I love that. I think that's really cool. And it's going to be like a new era of this stuff where we can just like work together and like find the truth. And
it's
complement
really,
each other.
It's really refreshing because it's really refreshing to work together because I'm sure as like everybody who's done some research in this subject knows, like any sort of disclosure is not really going to come willingly, especially when it comes to, UFO legacy program operations. So kind of working together and tackling cases and stuff like that is really brilliant to do. And Chris is a great guy. You introduced me to him at the hearings. And, you know, the second he and I met, he and I were talking about Bob Lazar because he did the interview with Luigi from Project Gravatar.
Yep.
He spoke very highly of him. And
Luigi's super cool. I've talked to him. He's awesome. So this is this new documentary about Bob Lazar. Bob Lazar is obviously, if you've made it this far in the interview, you definitely know who Bob Lazar is.
Yeah,
but he is, you know, famous for having claimed to have, you know, reverse engineered UFOs at Area 51 S4, and you know, one of Rogan's biggest episodes. This wild controversy, some holes in his background, but like spoken to Luigi and Chris, and they've actually really helped me update my take on Bob Lazar to the point where I think he worked at Area 51 for sure.
Area 51 or S4?
I think he for sure worked at Area 51, probably worked at S4.
Okay.
And then I'm not sure that what he was shown wasn't shown to him deliberately, and he wasn't given high-level frameworks as sort of passage material and recruitment for legacy, which doesn't make covering his story invalid at all.
Right.
It makes it almost more interesting, but to me, it has to be covered through this like meta lens.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Well,
through the skepticism, but also like there's probably some real stuff.
Yeah.
Here.
I mean, I've historically stayed away from Bob because I'm so biased towards wanting to believe him.
Yeah.
You know, growing up, I would always hear about his testimony. I was the first to buy Area 51 or UFOs and Flying Saucers from Jeremy Corbell and his book Dreamland.
Yep.
The more I study other things, the more interest I find specifically not Bob Lazar reverse engineering the sports model propulsion systems or reading about the files of bodies and so forth, but specifically around the facility S4, which like I have good reason to believe that S4 is south of or just southwest of Papoose mountain range, right by Papoose Lake, is a real place.
And what's your good reason to believe that?
So there's a couple public testimonies around it. There's that I don't really want to focus on, but like Dan Barish, Edgar Fouchet, who claimed that S4 ran the Defense Advanced Research Center, the DARS, which was found in a ARPA document in the 70s to be proposed to exist, which was an underground facility, never really proven to exist. But I've talked to one person who has been to S4,
Whoa.
and another person who said they won't comment on if it exists. The person who had been to S4 said he didn't see anything like crazy or extraterrestrial. He was just went in the facility, but he did say some things that are similar to what Bob Lazar and others would say, meaning like colored pathways to show where you can walk and so forth.
I think we should all wait for Luigi's documentary, Project Gravatar, because he's told me things offline that out of respect for him, I'm not going to share, but that give me conviction that he did work at S4 around stuff that's that will get corroborated in the documentary. So it's pretty cool. So yeah, I'm citing Chris has as well, and Chris is coming at this whole thing from an angle of like he's a famous magician before this, debunking other magicians, and so he comes at this whole thing through a more skeptical storytelling lens, and he thinks that there's definitely something to the Lazar story, and that he worked at S4.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, if that story is true, then that's one example of a deep underground military base with a hangar built into the side of a mountain, which is really interesting.
Yep.
Because deep underground military bases, a lot of people associate those with conspiracies for like human trafficking or stuff like that. But those are a very real concept. There's like a very rich history of deep underground military bases that started in the 1950s and 1960s out of Air Force Project RAND, which eventually became the RAND Corporation, which is a federally funded research and development center that is likely up to their eyeballs in UFO legacy programs. But
why do you think there's so many things that, like, when you talk, I'm like, we need to query this and this and that. Like, why is Rand so?
So one of the things that I talk about all the time that I think is really overlooked in legacy operations is everybody likes to talk about the government, intelligence, or military, and contractors. Northrop, Lockheed, Battelle. The piece that's missing, the thing between them, are the federally funded research and development centers and the university-affiliated research centers. These are semi-private, not-for-profit institutions that are government-owned. Examples of FFRDCs would be places like the MITRE Corporation, the RAND Corporation, Sandia National Labs, Lawrence Livermore.
There's one at Penn State where Eric Walker was.
Well, that's a university-affiliated research center.
Okay, yep.
And those are kind of another side of the same coin. And we can talk about what I think, based on some good intelligence, that what I think these do. University-affiliated research centers are like the MIT Soldier Nanotechnology
Super Soldier
Lab.
program.
Yeah, the University of Southern California, a Creative Research Institute.
And that's another really interesting thing where I think Bob Lazar might have done something in and around the MIT.
He could have.
Well, like that. Whenever he comes up with Rogan always says, "Oh, I'll tell you something offline where like it would make the MIT records being deleted make sense."
Yeah.
And then he can never say it online.
Could be a UARC.
That would be my guess, that there's probably some interesting research, that he was maybe involved in, that like, because that from way back in the day at MIT was, Carl Compton, who was president of MIT, who was rumored to be shown the craft at Wright Airfield with this sort of Anderson Trust, these like, CIA guys, and actually like be very involved in legacy UFO efforts. And so, it's fascinating. And now we have this Super Soldier program.
And so with those FFRDCs and UARCs, what I think based on good intelligence is that the U.S. military and intelligence sources split between the Army, Navy, and Air Force will have a program, whether that be technology exploitation, materials research, reverse engineering, or flying of alien reproduction vehicles. And direct connections will be made with the UARCs, or FFRDCs. These will serve as the project manager, performing subject matter expertise and research and development. And that will bridge the gap to the contractors, the defense corporations, because most, as far as I'm aware, most of the contractor personnel will not necessarily know what they're working on. A famous example is the infographic show Whistleblower, where he talks about a guy at Texas Instruments getting a piece of metal and not knowing what he's working on. It's the middle management at these companies, at the contractors, that generally know what they're working on, like the security directors and so forth. But the FFRDCs and UARCs allows kind of one-step removal between the military and intelligence and the contractor.
Well, but with MITRE Corporation and RAND, you would think of them as having kind of the top of the pyramid view on the technology. Yeah. Like, I believe the president of RAND Corporation for many years was a guy named Michael Rich, who's Ben Rich. Yeah. Ben Rich was the, president of Skunk Works that says we have, the power to travel to
take
stars,
ET
to
home.
take ET home, and made all sorts of interesting comments. Like at the end of his career, he also called UFOs unfunded opportunities.
Yeah.
Said that we have UFOs and they have UFOs, so like humans do and ETs do. Said there was an international corporate board controlling a lot of the UFOs and that maybe we needed to take it back into the hands of the US or something. Said all sorts of interesting stuff. His son was the president of Rand Corporation for decades. So I find that somewhat interesting as well. And Thomas Townsend Brown, when he's doing his anti-gravity experiments, the Rand Corporation shows up, sees the experiments. They have this meeting. Something changes after the meeting. Townsend Brown, his experiments just fail. Something sort of, nominally like they fail, even though clearly they hadn't failed.
Right.
And then to me, it's clear there's some covert IP transfer that occurs where his anti-gravity technology gets transferred to Northrop Grumman via his investor, who's a guy named Floyd Odlum, who has a majority stake in Northrop.
Yeah.
And so there's something around the Rand Corporation there too.
Absolutely. Rand, MITRE, Sandia, Sandia and Lawrence Livermore were accused by some people like Edgar Fouchet of actually reverse engineering propulsion for craft that would lead to like triangular ARV. But you also have to look at the time when a lot of these were made, specifically MITRE and the Aerospace Corporation. They were founded in 1959 and 1960, the exact time of the golden age of Army R&D under Corso. Who said that there were institutions also created to study extraterrestrial technology. And if you look at it, what's weird and what parallels to modern day with the UARCs and FFRDCs, if you look at U.S. Army research and development, this is going to sound so boring to so many people, but if you look at U.S. Army primers for research and development from the 1950s and 1960s, like read through all of their proposals, you'll see under Trudeau, when he was the chief of research and development for the Army, he proposed that the Army work for kind of technology transfer and technology study with URIs, University Research Institutes, and IRILs, I think it is, like independent research or something, independent research laboratories, similar, which are similar concepts to the UARCs and FFRDCs made in the 90s. So we see these insane parallels to modern day. And of course, MITRE was made out of Project SAGE, which was a Lincoln Labs giant project to like make giant radar systems to study ballistic missiles and so forth.
Well, it's like if you were doing any secret science, if we live in the world where any science is classified, which come on. Yeah, of course and now like it's all coming out. You have people like Mark Andreessen, Ben Horowitz go to the White House. They say we'll classify math and the AI just like we classified physics. And like Eric Weinstein, my former colleague, is constantly kind of opining on like this idea of the secret science branch. You have to be stupid to not think that some science isn't classified. If we live in the world where it is classified, that stuff is going on in the places where we uphold the most secrecy, which is these DOE labs.
Yeah.
And so like,
a lot of
I
them
don't think
DOE
it's like
as well.
conspiratorial. It's like, obviously, if you're doing a high energy, really intense physics, you're probably also understanding ontological truths that the rest of the public don't understand. That's often the case. Like you start to understand things about reality due to some of these experimental effects where you're breaking the bounds of our reality in some sense, through these, high energy experiments. Like it makes sense that UFOs show up around nuclear weapons.
Absolutely.
It's high energy output. And if we live in any sort of like time bound, 3D bound, like if there's anything outside of what we perceive, you would be stress testing that every time you set a nuke off. You just would.
Yeah.
So it's like not that crazy.
And I'm with you there. And I just think it's so interesting to try and investigate how players and the government and military package these concepts and these high energy experiments to classify them and keep them out of public view, especially when it involves kind of extraterrestrials or non-human intelligence. And for the aero disenjoyers out there, as recently as 2024, the new Aero director, John Kozlowski, said that Aero is working with both UARCs and FFRDCs. So that's something to glom onto. Yeah, he said that to when Susan goes sitting right behind him to Gillibrand at the 2024 Aero hearing.
Whoa.
And then, of course, when Sean Kirkpatrick left Aero, he ran off to Oak Ridge, which go look at the FFRDC's connections there.
Totally. Yeah. Because, doing a lot of interesting material science there. It's not just a nuclear lab. Like they're doing a lot of frontier science at Oak Ridge.
Many FFRDCs are owned by Battelle Memorial Labs or Triad National Security LLC, which one of those three is Battelle. Battelle's really interesting. I mean, if there's any group out there that is studying actual biologics, it's probably Battelle. They run some sort of biological materials lab out of Fort Detrick, and also a lot of really interesting classified work out at Dugway Proving Grounds.
It's fascinating. Yeah, and that was always, I believe, was it the HC Cross? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
This memo that
Project Stork from
Project
Battelle.
Stork from Battelle, where it's now clear in retrospect, and I think this is a lot due to Richard Dolan's great research, that like you had this cleaving off of the vital study of UFOs. The public-facing stuff was relegated to Project Blue Book in the Air Force, and then all the private stuff was managed by Battelle Memorial Institute, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, and was classified under the Atomic Energy Commission, which occurred later in '54, but there's a precursor called the McMahon Secrecy Act. And so it would totally make sense that Battelle would have a whole lot to do with this. I believe Robert Sarbacher also told Whitley Strieber. So Sarbacher, I just interviewed Whitley Strieber.
Wow, he talked to Sarbacher?
He talked to Sarbacher. Sarbacher took an interest in Strieber.
And when he published Communion?
When he published Communion.
I'll tell you a fairly weird story here. Stanton gave me Sarbacher's number, and then he called me back and he said, Sarbacher is waiting for you to call him. He's very eager to talk to you. So I call Sarbacher. Sarbacher proceeds to tell me all kinds of detail about the materials that he was working on at the Battelle Memorial Institute, about how when electron microscopes became operative, they understood that there was a molecular grid, a designed grid inside this very thin material, and that was what made it so strong. And I think that's probably been extrapolated out into our military technology in many different ways.
And so you're talking about an extremely advanced scientist taking an interest in a horror novelist's abduction account. And so Sarbacher's working at the highest levels of American military, and he takes an interest in Whitley Strieber, reaches out, wants to speak to him, and Strieber says they're about to meet up, and Sarbacher dies.
Oh yeah.
And so it's fascinating. And then again, Sarbacher's just scrubbed from the internet. But what Sarbacher, I think, told Strieber on the phone is that you had all this interesting material that Battelle Memorial Institute was managing back in the day that Sarbacher was somewhat involved with. So just another piece of corroboration for this.
And there's research to suggest that Battelle also studied the really lightweight metals out of the 1947 Roswell crash. In 1949, alongside Project Stork, they started publishing information on shaped metal alloys, nitinol.
There was like a nickel alloy. Or something?
Titanium nickel alloys.
Yeah.
I used to think that Battelle was kind of phased out of operations. I'm not quite sure why I thought this, but recently I've taken a huge interest in Battelle being like one of the primary contractors out at Dugway Proving Grounds, which I think has a massive underground facility. I mean, I've talked to a witness who didn't go on the 2023 Greer NPC, but I've talked to him and I've interviewed him. And he, while working as a contractor for the C. Martin Company at Dugway at the West Desert Test Wing in the Avery section, stumbled upon a building where he saw a craft hovering in the air being tested on.
So fascinating.
Yeah. And then Battelle has a bunch of old contracts for making like enclosed laboratories at Dugway and stuff. And that is really fascinating. And
is there a Mormon connection with Dugway? Because it's in Utah. And
Greer,
I think of like the CIA as being fed into by just a lot of Mormons. Mormons were surrounding sort of, Howard Hughes.
Well, Greer likes to say so, right? But I don't know. I haven't been able to make that connection. But I was able to make a Dugway Proving Ground connection to one of your recent videos with James Fox.
Oh, tell me.
So I was rewatching your James Fox interview, and he talks about the 1971 the Holloman Air Force Base footage that he talked to filmmaker Alan Sandler, who said he saw the footage and saw beings in the footage.
Yeah, we showed that conversation between him and Sandler.
Yeah.
What did you see on the film? Was it color? Was it black and white?
Was it black and white?
It was black and white.
When I saw you, it was beautiful, black, my friend, but it was nothing other than what we said in the book. We see this thing, this round thing, and it wasn't that stable, funny part. And it landed, and a door opened, and guys come out looking like they were outer space guys.
So in 1971, Sandler and another filmmaker, Robert Emenegger or something like that, I think his name was.
Emenegger, yeah.
Yeah, they were approached by two U.S. military officials to make a documentary, and they could include the Holloman Air Force Base footage.
Yep.
One of these individuals was an Army or Air Force, I can't remember, a colonel named Weinbrenner. And Weinbrenner was actually part of the Foreign Technology Division out of Wright-Pat for a while.
Whoa.
So that occurred in the 80s or the late 70s. And so time goes on. Weinbrenner would be asked all the time about UFOs because Robert Emenegger would go back and ask him, like, what did you think? And, there's a story of a conversation where he and Weinbrenner are speaking, and Weinbrenner saying, like, oh, UFOs don't exist, blah, 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 while taking a book off his shelf and giving him a book about UFOs. But on his deathbed, there's a lot of research proposed by, like, Grant Cameron and Anthony Bragalia and so forth about Weinbrenner on his deathbed saying that they house dead extraterrestrials at a facility out in Utah, which of course is Dugway Proving Grounds.
Ooh, it's really crazy.
So I made that connection last night. That was fun to see, the Sandler to Weinbrenner to Dugway.
Sammy, are you in touch with any UFO whistleblowers, not whistleblowers yet, people on the inside who have firsthand witnessed crafts?
Absolutely, yeah.
And anybody who has witnessed craft in a hangar, in a classified facility in the U.S., not just seeing a thing flying in the air.
Yeah.
That's wild, man.
Yeah, but will they talk publicly? No. And will they discuss the full extent?
Why won't they talk publicly? I do think it's important context for the audience, like, we're gonna get comments. Trust me, bro, or whatever. So what's your
no? I'm not saying that to like push like a narrative or say like run with this. Like I know people have seen this, not a trust me, bro thing. But yeah, of course I've talked to people I take very seriously, like good friends that I've made who have said this, and these people are former military or intelligence. They're not contractors. I haven't heard a peep from a contractor. I think that's a whole nother story because there's government NDAs and contractor NDAs, and the penalties for violating those are severe. But these military people are bound by NDAs, some timed, which usually really long NDAs, like decades long, or lifelong agreements, and they do not want to be the person to violate.
Any who've seen bodies?
One of them has talked about a place in which bodies are stored.
Where are they stored?
We'll save that because that might lead to people being able to identify that person.
Anything about the bodies and
no,
what they
nothing
look
about
like?
The bodies, because I think that is privy to their a lot of their NDAs and so forth. So they can't talk about that.
How do you think this stuff gets so well hidden? I think there are some really important foundational questions that the Jake Barber story brings up, which is if you can summon these things on command, then you probably have 1,000 plus. And if you have 1,000 plus, then you'd expect more leakage. You'd expect more like, I saw the thing in the hangar and I wasn't supposed to. I took a photo and it's out. You hear rumors on the other side of this that we have 10 to 15 and they're like, only select things and surround atomic sites or whatever.
Yeah.
How many do we have? 10 to 15 and 1,000 plus. It's a wide range. And so clearly we can't fully attract these things at will would be my guess. Cause I think if we had 1,000 plus, these things would have leaked. So do you have kind of like a mental model on that?
That's a good question, because if we look at Ryan S. Wood's fantastic book, Magic Eyes Only, we can find over 100 cases of UFO crash retrieval. And even if only 20% of those are true, that's still, above 20. There's also claims by Greer and others that at some of these black sites, 1 to 2 craft are brought down a year. So I have no conceivable notion of how many craft have been brought down or why they're brought down. You got guys like Philip J. Corso who talk about the initial Roswell crash being due to kind of conflicting radio signatures, messing with craft navigation. You have testimonies like the 1953 Kingman, Arizona crash where possibly nuclear testing from Operation Upshot Knothole messed with craft. And then you have Barber's testimony that psionic abilities can forcefully land craft or bring them down, or they have EM weapons to target the craft and bring them down. And then there's also stories about the 1983 Strategic Defense Initiative instituted by Ronald Reagan, which was to act against Soviet ICBMs.
This is Star Wars.
Yeah, this is the Star Wars programs. I've talked to numerous people, and I talk about this all the time in my projects, that this likely had a backdoor to both fund UAP programs and act offensively against UAP. So there seems to be numerous methods for them to crash accidentally or be brought down forcefully. How often is that successful? I have no idea. And what sort of technology is being brought down? In Jake's case, we have the testimony of the egg and the 8-gon, and there's also the classic saucer and so forth. And this technology is obviously not ubiquitous. There's different types of technology. There's different craft design. One could reasonably assume then there's different types of NHI, some manned, some not manned. I often think back to the 2008, I'll say this slow because it's of course very complicated, but the 2008 contractor that rhymes with Lockheed Barton wanting to divest themselves of a craft to...
You could say this. David Grush said this on Joe Rogan.
Oh, okay. So in 2008, when Lockheed wanted to get rid of materials to the OSAT program through the CIA office, the Directorate of Science and Technology, Glenn Gaffney.
And he blocked that.
Correct. He blocked that, stopped that from happening. And, I have really good reason to believe that this was materials for the craft from the 1953 Kingman crash. Mm-hmm. And there's also other lines of research.
I believe that too, by the way.
Good.
Yeah.
And there's other lines of research to suggest that Lockheed, the only reason they were able to give this up is because they were completely comfortable in the fact that no other contractor, no other foreign government or no U.S. government could make any heads or tails with this technology. And that stands at a huge juxtaposition from all the other stories of alien reproduction vehicles being created.
Yeah, so where are you there? Because I think this is really important, is like how much have we actually reverse engineered, made progress, and made these things flyable? And you've gone really deep on this interesting story of Mark McCandlish and Brad Sorensen. But I'd love to hear, let's go over that story, and then I also just want to kind of zoom out and get your view on, like, have we reverse engineered UFOs effectively?
Okay, so Brad Sorensen, he's an industrial designer with his friend, aerospace illustrator, who had worked for defense contractors, Popular Science, Mark McCandlish. In October to December of 1988.
Yeah, so McCandlish is a top aviation illustrator, working with the biggest contractors. And you hear him speak, and like the guy doesn't seem like a liar to me.
He was a genius.
He was just super smart and like just almost like slightly, I don't want to say autistic, but like you just hear him speak and he oozes authenticity.
Yeah. So Mark and Brad are to go to an air show at Norton Air Force Base in 1988. Mark had to not go to do work for Popular Mechanics. We can actually see the cover of that magazine he worked on. So Brad goes with some former high-up official. I initially at the time thought it might have been Frank Carlucci, but it might have been somebody else he went with. The air show's going on. There's all types of interesting stuff, fighters, advanced technologies, and so forth. And then the person Brad is with brings him to a classified exhibit at another hangar and passes Brad off as his aide. This was a former Secretary of Defense or really high up person, and there were other senators there, George E. Brown Jr., Cranston, so forth. Mark kind of thought this might have been flown down to Air Force Plant 42, a couple miles away. But after further research and talking to some people, I do think this event did occur at Norton. So Brad Sorensen is brought into a hangar where all sorts of advanced aerospace vehicles are shown off.
So this is like a back of the house, more secret version of the air show, only for select people.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And so there's like a hovercraft. There's the losing competitor to the B-2 Spirit bomber race. There's a craft called the Pulsar, which is likely a Lockheed Northrop group craft. It's an unmanned UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle. And it was designed to go at incredible speeds with scramjet technology to go super fast that could deploy like 120 nuclear warheads on its underbelly. Insane piece of technology. And this whole giant hangar is separated by black curtain. So eventually they go to the other side of the black curtain, and that's where Mama, Baby, and Papa Bear are. These are 3 flying saucers hovering off the ground. Identical in composition, but scaled to different sizes. What stood out to me from...
these look like acorn shaped, is that right?
Yeah. It looks like a Jell-O mold with half a ping pong ball at the top.
Yep. And so sort of a typical saucer shape, or maybe what you would see in the Kecksburg crash of 1965.
Almost.
Like a dome on top. And
like a dome on top. And I want to pause here for a second because historically people have said that Mark McCandlish has relayed this story secondhand, which he has because he created line art of the craft, which we'll go into in a second. But this was not supposed to be published, what I found. And I was told it wasn't supposed to be published by a person. But I found an original interview from, I think, 1990 with Brad Sorensen and Bill Scott of Aviation Week and Space Technology. So no longer is this a secondhand retelling. No, this is straight from Brad Sorensen, okay? This is not a secondhand encounter. This is straight from Brad, who, by the way, gave me death threats I don't like Brad. Not a nice guy.
Yeah, well, he sent you some pretty weird shots across the bow.
Yeah.
And said something about, so Mark McCandless died a sort of strange death.
Right.
And he said something like, I couldn't protect him anymore or something.
Yeah.
And then I believe the filmmaker who made this documentary, I forget what the name of the documentary is on Mark McCandless.
Yeah.
What's it called? 0 Point? Something about 0 Point?
Yeah, the hunt for...
It's not the hunt for 0 Point, but something about...
like the story of Mark McCandless.
That's right. Something like that. I think James Allen.
Yeah.
He died in a weird
Super
way.
aggressive cancer. In his autopsy report, it showed evidence of heavy metal poisoning.
Right.
So I've actually talked to the editor of that interview since, and he said that they had received kind of threats, like Men in Black type encounters and so forth. So
somebody did not want this out.
Yeah.
And so, okay, Brad Sorensen actually has a firsthand interview with Bill Scott of Aviation Week.
Yeah.
Goes back to the early 90s. What is he, or when was it?
1990.
Was it 1990?
Yeah.
So what does he say?
So he said he saw these 3 craft. There was a demonstration by like cats in suits with a kind of a VCR and a video showing the craft over a dry lake bed, hopping, shooting up into the air. And there were some panels pulled off of the craft, and essentially the bottom portion had what looked like a giant like Tesla coil, almost like copper plates and a rotary arm to reach out. The top part looked like a removable crew cabin. This had F4 Phantom jump seat, super crap, like a handball control mechanism, which, by the way, that was the control mechanism for the Triangular Craft and Secret Machines by Tom DeLonge. But that's a whole other story. And the thing looked like, all 3 looked like crap. Sorensen said that it looked like it was made by scientists, not engineers. There was no beauty in design. There was no streamlining of features. There was slag on it, chips. These things looked like they had beaten up. There were rivets on the outside. And so eventually during the pitch for this was to garner funding, because Reagan had put a lot of effort into this project with Star Wars and so forth. And the incoming administration, they wanted to see just as much advanced aerospace money put in. And so the story behind this by the men in charge was that these craft were copied from technology found in a crash in 47. The technology was not given to us. It was forcibly taken. It was never meant to be had. The people who it was taken from, or the things that it was taken from, it was taken forcefully. And that this was our poor man's interpretation of how this technology worked.
So interesting, because that's the rumor about Roswell. It was high-powered radar that we sort of, that interfered with the flight patterns of these UFOs, and then they come down, and we weren't meant to have this stuff. And then you hear rumors in and around legacy programs of like whatever beings are in control of the UFOs like want their stuff back and are extremely angry at the legacy UFO programs. And so that begets all sorts of weird ontological questions there. But I want to stick with the core details. So what else gives you conviction that this is true and that we do have flyable UFOs? Because I just think, so many people are going to sort of be skeptical.
Right.
About that.
I completely understand. It's such a crazy topic, but this was the birthplace of what we'll call ARV, Alien Reproduction Vehicle. This was kind of the first ever big testimony of it. And Mark McCandless, before he passed in 2020 due to a self-inflicted gunshot wound that, who knows, he investigated the flux liner, what it was called, ARV, multiple times. He talked to an individual named Kent Sellen, who said he saw this over Edwards Air Force Base in the 70s. He has an image taken by a pilot, Harvey something, I can't quite remember, over Provo, Utah, right by Dugway Proving Grounds in the 60s. And that looks identical down to the synthetic vision system on the outside, which was an array of cameras to kind of point to a location. And
that's what's so interesting about this. It's as if we were given this sort of intact shell, and then we retroactively patchworked on like kind of low tech.
Yeah, like the jump seats.
And the cameras, and then you kind of like make this thing work, but like it's this really low tech combined with the really high tech that we were given or something.
But this isn't the only example. There's the controversial account of Edgar Fouchet. A lot of people like to discount, especially because they like to say that Fouchet has been debunked due to a lot of controversy with the alien scientist that I still think it's really worth revisiting. I talked about it a little bit, but
the alien scientist is this YouTuber named Jeremy Reese.
Yeah, and he had a relationship with Fouchet.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
I've talked to the guy. He's a nice guy.
Yeah, he's cool.
But he's pretty critical of Fouchet.
So yeah, what's up with Edgar Fouchet and
Fouchet was a USAF master sergeant that actually has
USAF is United States Air Force. Yeah,
he has verifiable work at Area 51 in the 70s.
Okay,
and he said whilst at Area 51, he would work on like advanced satellite uplinks and so forth, but he would come to learn from various friends he knew, including some NSA officials, of the TR-3B reverse engineered flying triangle.
Yep.
Weirdly enough, I've talked to a guy who former Army in the mid 2010s who said he saw a triangle craft jut off of an airway in Area 51. That's pretty interesting.
Well, we can say this now because I said this in my piece with Randy Anderson. Randy Anderson, who you introduced me to, this Green Beret, amazing guy who claimed to be taken, to this Off-World Technologies Division, Naval Surface Warfare Crane. Also, occasionally does contractor work at Area 51, and he's told both of us now, and I've said this publicly, that he has seen triangle craft that he can only presume uses electrogravitic propulsion because it's not using, normal flight principles, at least observably to him, take off at Area 51.
Yeah. Well, this is even a separate guy too.
Okay, so you have another guy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he said that this took off during in the Chow Hall at A51 during classified takeoffs of aircraft. The windows are supposed to be lowered. Nobody looks outside, but because he was with a colonel, they just kind of looked outside, and a craft took up. It didn't disturb any of the dust around it. Shot up silently, just vertically straight up. And
there's so many stories about this. Even Paul Benowitz, who was totally mentally screwed up with and psyoped by Rick Doty, Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Project Beta is a great book by Greg Bishop, documents all of this. Even him, like the reason that he got onto the radar of all these kind of like counter intel people was because he saw this craft, vertically taking off and landing at Kirtland Air Force Base that looked to be like it was employing exotic flight principles.
Right.
And we know from William Steinman, this great researcher, UFO researcher, that this guy Eric Henry Wang, who ran special projects at Wright-Patterson, or Wright Airfield at the time, was taken to Kirtland Air Force Base to work probably on some of this exotic flight stuff.
Yeah, and Wang was also talked about by primary Kingman witness Arthur Stancil Jr.
Yep.
So that's funny too. But this craft, the TR-3B, there were allegedly multiple versions, a prototype and operational version ranging from 200 to 600 feet in diameter, crewing 4, serving as logistics and transportation for what could only be known as a secret space fleet. The propulsion device for the system was reverse engineered by Sandia and Livermore, 2 FFRDCs. The program was ran by the NSA, CIA, and NRO.
Whoa.
And the contractors at work were Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, a couple others. But
I hate to say this all makes so much sense.
Yeah,
but it just fits so well with all the other stuff you learned.
This is the most interesting part to me about the whole TR-3B thing.
Yeah.
Fouchet says the pilots for this were plucked from the Air Force Test Pilot School, which takes place at Edwards, which is the 412th Test Wing. There's a witness that contacted Greer in 2023 that I found his name, investigated him thoroughly in an Edwards piece that claimed he operated out of Edwards Air Force Base in Nellis and Area 51 on testing reverse engineered vehicles. I have shown you a little bit about this guy, right, including like the work he did at the Pentagon and Nellis and Edwards, and he was a director of an electronics warfare group at Edwards under the 412th Test Wing, which is exactly what Fouchet said tested the TR-3B vehicles. That is a phenomenal case.
So what does he say exactly?
He said he tested reverse engineered vehicles and
at Area 51.
At Area 51 and Edwards. So he said in 1998 to 2002, this guy, Ed, was briefed into programs while he was at Nellis under the 98th Range Wing, which became the Nevada Test and Training Range, which is pretty interesting in itself. But that then in about 2006, he was sent to Edwards to actually work in said programs as a director of an electronics warfare group. And I vetted this guy quite well. I've tried to contact him in numerous ways.
Would you ever put it out a story with him, or
if he would talk to me, I would instantly.
Okay.
Instantly.
So you just know you're not in contact with him?
My number is blocked by him. I've tried to call him. I've tried to email him.
You've told me about him. Yeah.
I've tried to message him on social media. Funny enough, one time he accepted a Snapchat request.
Whoa.
And I messaged him, but he never
got back.
No. So this is what I think one of the most consequential, untapped testimonies there is.
So many of these guys, like as soon as you initiate contact, They say a little thing, and they
up.
say a thing, and they get kind of excited, and then they get spooked.
Well, Greer did the right thing with this witness, Ed. He was going to bring him in front of Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to testify. The guy got cold feet right beforehand. And I had this confirmed to me by elements of Senate and so forth. So this isn't just Greer saying that. But this guy was supposed to testify.
By like a Senate aide or like...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this guy was supposed to speak but got cold feet. Why? Is that because he was threatened? I don't know. There's other... if you look through the Greer archive, there's other witnesses. It's actually really interesting to see witnesses who are going to talk to Greer and so forth, but then say they've been threatened with some really horrible crimes. Like really gross
so messed
stuff.
up.
Yeah, that if they continue to talk will happen.
I just don't understand why there isn't some sort of limited disclosure around these things existing. Because it's like in the event in which, we're at par with China and Russia, why wouldn't you let out some like basic surface area that this stuff exists? Like that's what, is it just this bureaucratic bullshit overhang, or are there real national security reasons for not letting this stuff out? And not letting it fully out, but like nuclear physics is not classified.
Yeah.
Nuclear trade secrets are. Why is that not fully analogous to this?
I mean, it must be. Even looking at the testimony of Ed, he said 2009 to 2010, he was part of an Air Force going public plan that was called off by a 2-star general. Why?
There are all these. Well, it's like you had under the Bush White House, Bush 43.
Yeah,
they were going to do this sort of, possible. They were thinking about disclosure, and Hal Puthoff was part of this advisory group, and they were talking about it. And anyways, Bush 43. So Hal Puthoff is on record saying that Bush 43 contemplated disclosure with Stephen Hadley, National Security Advisor, and Dick Cheney, who David Grush is on record saying, was one of the gatekeepers for the program, and they decided that it was too ontologically shocking to let this out, and that we couldn't publicly disclose about UFOs. And I think that turned into a group where they were reading about, like, they're reading the 3-body problem and other things like that. So super interesting.
I mean, this could also boil down to...
And the 3-body problem, for people that don't know, is a Chinese science fiction novel.
It's a great series.
It's a great series, and it involves basically like aliens controlling almost all frontier science.
Yeah.
And sort of reality itself, and being able to stagnate, but also, upstart physics, and reality being sort of information theoretic in nature, and the whole thing is so fascinating.
And this could all deal with the subject of ARVs, but real quick, you mentioned Dick Cheney. A little interesting factoid is there is a supposed S4 whistleblower named Derek Hennessy who claimed he was a Navy SEAL. He wasn't a Navy SEAL. I had this confirmed, so already not off to a good start. But he claimed he worked at S4, and sometime in the mid-90s that Dick Cheney came into S4. But the funny connection there is that I can't remember the exact year, but Dick Cheney was actually going around to air bases around the U.S. to close up what he didn't think was operating efficiently. So that's kind of a funny
so we
connection.
know that he was going around to Air Force bases. That's fascinating.
But we don't. But Derek Hennessy lied about being a SEAL, so we don't know.
So we don't know what's up there.
Story.
Yeah. It's so. I mean, the Dick Cheney thing. I don't know what to think about it, but if there was a government behind our government, Dick Cheney would be the tip of the spear of that thing.
Yeah.
Like if you read, there's Barton Gellman biography of his called The Angler. And it's like that dude single-handedly architected the Iraq War based on like false intelligence. And he was a representative of a lot of oligarchic sort of corporate interests. And, and then Halliburton gets the contract once we kind of screw up Iraq, and then he gets the contract. It's like, there's something to that guy where you even read George W. Bush's book, Decision Points, and you're like, yeah, your decisions locally are being made based on, certain intelligence being given to you. And those decisions actually don't seem extremely irrational at each moment. And then it's like, who's giving you the intel? Yeah. And it's fucking Dick Cheney. And like, there's some other guys like, Wolfowitz and, sort of cast of neocon characters. But like, Cheney's at the heart of it.
Yeah, I mean, he would make sense as a person at the top of the pyramid like Grush says.
Yes. Yeah, person at the top of the pyramid, and maybe of a lineage. I'm about to do a piece on Henry Kissinger and UFOs.
Oh, cool, yeah.
And I think there's some connections there. And it's like, if you pick a modern Henry Kissinger, it would be Dick Cheney.
Yeah.
It's like, this guy is the man behind the man.
Right, but so we were talking about the ARV and the TR-3B.
Yeah.
And according to Fouchet and so forth, that's not the only triangular alien reproduction vehicle. That's in kind of UFO lore. There's also, if you reference forensic artists, I've talked about this a few times, Bill McDonald, who's done a lot of work on drawing the Roswell craft. He actually worked with Robert and Ryan Wood to create the two extraterrestrial biological entities mentioned in the Majestic document, the Special Operations Manual. In 1992, McDonald met with 2 Northrop and 2 Lockheed engineers who were fed up with the secrecy and classification of their work, who kind of dictated a drawing of a triangular ARV called the XF-131 Super Sentinel that operated off of like RCS, radar cross-section facilities in the Mojave Desert. And I've talked to McDonald about this, and he maintains the secrecy of these engineers to this day. Because I said, hey, can I talk to these people? But that design actually was featured in the first ever episode of the X-Files because I can't Chris
Carr.
Yeah, Chris. Yeah. Contracted Bill McDonald to put that in the
Chris Carr is the creator of the X-Files.
Right. Bill McDonald was contracted to put that in the first ever episode of the X-Files, which was allegedly based on true stories from John D'Souza. And that episode is about a triangular alien reproduction vehicle that's seen over an Air Force base. And it's the same design. I've featured some clips of that. That's so interesting.
I think Hollywood has been engaging in soft UFO disclosure for 30 or 40 years through these CIA liaisons.
We have Spielberg's new movie, Disclosure.
It's called Disclosure. And I was talking to Chris Ramsey, again, great YouTube channel, go follow it, Area51.
Yeah,
and he was like, what if a UFO is shown as part of that movie? Would that not be the best way to disclose? And like, I'm on his side. Like maybe that happens. And then historically too, you've had, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which involves Jacques Vallée and J. Allen Hynek. Jacques Vallée is played as a character by Francois Truffaut. You see crates that say Lockheed and Northrop.
Don't they say
Skunkworks and TRW?
TRW.
If they say that, then you're like, okay, they're talking about next level knowledge. Then they really know.
Because TRW was bought by Northrop in 2002.
Right.
And TRW was the contractor behind the Zodiac story, which was an alleged crash.
So I think they do say Skunkworks, and because Close Encounters of the Third Kind was they do? Okay. I don't know.
Interesting fact about TRW. Yeah. Jacques Vallée has talked about Dr. Eric A. Walker, we talked about earlier, being on the board of directors or a chairman of TRW as well.
Oh, wow. Fascinating.
Spielberg was dialed in with, you have to go deep to talk about Skunkworks and TRW in the film.
Yeah. Well, let's look up, at some point, whether it's Lockheed and Northrop.
It's Skunkworks.
You're sure? Okay.
Yeah, Skunkworks and
well, that's
TRW.
next level. Then, he knows a lot of knowledge. Also, on the Townsend Brown, who I'm sure discovered some interesting effects in the world of gravity. I'm sure of that. I feel very high conviction in that. And I just interviewed Carl Nell, who's the deputy CTO of Northrop Grumman, where I'm saying, again, that this gravity technology got probably implemented in the B-2 stealth bomber. Yeah. And he's the deputy CTO of Northrop Grumman, and he goes, go watch Jesse's video on Thomas Townsend Brown when I ask him, is there anything sort of useful or applicable in the UFO story?
Jesse's done a number of podcasts looking into Taylor Townsend Brown and some other very interesting like heretical technologies. So I'd invite people, an unsolicited plug, to check out some of Jesse's podcasts.
So there's more corroboration beyond that on the TT Brown stuff. But where was I going with? What were you just saying? The
TRW, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Before that.
Okay. So Steven Spielberg executive produced Back to the Future.
Yeah.
And the subplot of the whole Thomas Townsend Brown story is that gravity affects time. Mm-hmm. In general relativity, gravity and time are tightly coupled and they're related. And he talks about time travel constantly with his family. Like, that's something that's really, and if you think about it, if we were to ever engage in effective interstellar travel, it would involve space-time metric engineering inherently. You can't get around that. Even with nuclear thermal propulsion, you get to the closest star system in 40,000 years. Biologically, that does not work, right? So he's super into time travel. And then you have Back to the Future come out, which is a Steven Spielberg executive produced movie. The guy's name is Doc Brown, which everybody called Thomas Townsend Brown. Mm-hmm. His name is Emmett Brown, E-M-E-T-T Brown. Thomas Townsend Brown is in the name. He uses his flux capacitor. Thomas Townsend Brown's experiments are capacitor experiments. And he goes back in time in 1985, which is the year Thomas Townsend Brown dies, to 1957, which is when I think his experiment was first experimentally proven, around that time at the Bonson Labs. It's the time that physics sort of went astray in the wrong direction, when I think the anti-gravity stuff went black. And so it's just, I don't know, there's so much there. that I think begets this like greater. And then E.T. even is extremely interesting.
Yeah.
E.T. and the kid like they have some sort of weird psionic connection. And you remember they're in the hospital together, and E.T.'s like heart rate is matching the kid's heart rate. And you have all this stuff around the psionic connection that's now coming out. You also have the consciousness connection there, where the mother is walking around the kitchen, and like these kids see the ETs, but the mother doesn't. And like the ET is sort of like walking around the fridge, and the mother doesn't see it because like her perceptive, she's closed off to these realities. So like I think Steven Spielberg definitely has been fed some really interesting UFO stuff over the years.
And was it Spielberg or Cameron that created the film The Abyss?
That was James Cameron.
Okay, because that's also an interesting one about USO.
Totally.
It's interesting to see these concepts relate in Hollywood, because
James Cameron, Steven Spielberg, and Christopher Nolan are definitely fed intense secret shit.
Yeah,
they have to be. I'm sorry.
Because on one hand, you have films like Independence Day, which is just a bombastic action film glorified. But then on the other hand, you have very thoughtful projects like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and to an extent E.T. and as we know now.
But even like not so even like, where does the concept of Men in Black get to? Men in Black sounds quacky.
Yeah.
But like, if you go talk to Richard Dolan, he's a super deep UFO researcher. Men in Black are they are this thing. They're in these suits, and they show up after UFO abduction experiences, UFO sightings, and they often take people's footage or like, swear them to secrecy. And Dolan thinks they're almost like the counter intel group of the aliens themselves. They erase your memory. And so it's turned into this like kind of jokey, funny, movie with Will Smith. But like, even that, like, where is that derived to begin with?
Right.
And it's just it's so fascinating,
That's interesting because I've heard that idea floated around before, that the like colloquial Men in Black are almost like a non-human entity. Because I'd like to hear more about that, because I almost stand on the other side. I straight up think the Men in Black, in a sense, are NSA spooks.
So I would say the same thing, but like, you meet with certain people like Whitley Strieber and other just experiencers, and like these guys seem to like have technology available to them that's not available to the general public. And maybe that is just like, okay, so it's like Occam's razor, it's like NSA or something, but it's weird technology. It's like implants that involve technological mediumship, as Whitley Strieber. I felt his implant in his ear.
Really?
Yeah, I felt it. And it's the weirdest thing in the world. And he says it moves with his own metabolism. I haven't verified that, but like...
Has he ever thought about getting that cut out?
He wants to get it cut out, but he says it moves every time. And I felt the thing, and it's not natural. So unless he's totally grifting and putting the thing in his ear, even though he's not really like making that much money now off of UFOs, and it happened after he wrote Communion, and like it's like... I don't know, man. The whole thing's so strange.
That is interesting. That, perhaps the two are not mutually exclusive. Because there's also stories like, have you heard of Treat? It's the supposed Men in Black unit out of the NSA called the Tactical Reconnaissance Engineering Assessment Search Team, which was created by Stubblebine. And it's only ever been talked about by Fouchet and Hans Adams, the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein.
So that's come up for me, and I've never brought that up. But how do you think that the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, because I've heard some very interesting things about him. He seems like a really cool guy, but like really interested in the spooky science stuff.
I've only ever seen his discussions with like Greer and the emails on the DPI archive, and looked up a few things about him and him mentioning Treat. Besides that, I have no idea, because I would see that and I said, Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, a small Central European company. What have you found out about him? Because that's pretty interesting.
I don't. I don't know. I probably shouldn't say, because the conversations I've had are in confidence, but he seems very interesting and interested in sort of secret science. One more piece of possible corroboration of, maybe it being a combo as far as the Men in Black is, I did speak to Hal Puthoff recently, and I was trying to figure out, I was like, is it their program? Is it the NHI program or is it our program? And he goes, what if it's a joint space program? He goes, I might believe that. Maybe there's something in where we're in. That? He did, yeah. To me.
Jeez.
Yeah. So, and Hal Puthoff is, I think, as deep as it gets when it comes to sort of outside the Overton window science, which is now being vindicated. I mean, he was just on a podcast in December which was co-sponsored by National
like
Science
ecosystem.
Foundation.
Yeah.
And like you had like pretty high up DOE people on the podcast and all these amazing people with all pretty impressive credentials. The former head of revolutionary tech at Skunkworks are all on this podcast. And he's talking about extended electrodynamics and gravity manipulation. And I think it's clearly this sort of limited hangout where it's like, let's partially expose some things so that people can, you know, learn a little bit more about some science that we've been sitting on, especially, again, if China has caught up. You can't just, you know, throw people off the trail constantly. You need some limited surface area around it. But yeah, Hal Puthoff did say, and you know, it's always, I love Hal, but it's always this sort of like, you know, tongue in cheek, like half speculating. So you never quite know.
He never commits to something.
He always goes, the whole zoo of possibilities. And I was like, A, B, C, and D. And then you have to decide, you know?
Sometimes I wonder about Hal and how much he'll commit to subjects, because under his tutelage and good friend, of course, is Eric Davis.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, like, as you know, Missile Man, myself, and others talking to Eric Davis.
You did a great interview with Eric Davis.
He said a lot of interesting things, but he also said a couple things I disagree with. One, he said that the only FFRDC he knew of was the Aerospace Corporation, which I disagree with, but I think that's because he was only read into a sub-selection of legacy programs under OSAP. But he also said that alien reproduction vehicles don't exist.
Do you think there's aircraft systems that have kind of leveraged technologies off?
Definitely no aircraft systems that have leveraged anything. And there's been no one-to-one reproduction. A lot of that fell into the psyche of the UFO community because of Bob Lazar and then Brad Sorensen and Mark McCandless. So I don't know where they're coming from. And then other people kind of came out of the woodwork saying the same thing, but no proof.
Right. And I'm only left with two possibilities when I think about that. One is that he's lying. Two is that he was only read into a select subsection of programs that only overlapped Lockheed trying to get rid of Kingman materials, and thus he would not know about ARV because those weren't part of the program. And I kind of lean towards that explanation because I really don't agree with that assessment. And at the end of the interview, I had a little notebook with the flux liner on it. And I said, you know, Dr. Davis, you really haven't even considered this testimony of Mark McCandless and the flux liner. And he said, but right before we cut off, well, Hal Puthoff interviewed Brad Sorensen. And we never got to talk about that more. And to this day, I want to ask him so badly about how that went, because Hal has spoken to Sorensen.
Wow.
And I just need to know how that goes. I wish Hal could speak a little bit more candidly in an open setting, because he's also super cagey in the program with James Fox. And he's also kind of integral to the story of Zodiac, the alleged crash retrieval program first introduced in UFO Magazine in 1998.
What is Zodiac?
God, that's a really interesting one. So in 1998, UFO Magazine published a story by pseudonym Greg Halifax about Sedge Masters, a story about somebody who is brought into a UFO crash retrieval program called Zodiac. This occurred in 1988. 2001 or 2002, there's an email chain with Hal Puthoff, Kit Green, and Eric Davis talking about the Santilli alien autopsy film and so forth, and Kit Green saying he saw different pictures of an alien autopsy. But then in a later thread in that email, one of the three brings up Zodiac and the Sedge Masters story. And most of this work needs to be credited to, of course, Richard Dolan, who actually tracked down the very likely author of the Zodiac story and puts a lot of faith that the Zodiac was indeed a crash retrieval program and it was operated by TRW. So that's just a fascinating story how even, it seems like everything kind of post-2000 or post-1995, Hal, Eric, and Kit.
What is the core story of Zodiac? Like, what is...
It's essentially the Majestic 12 by another name. Because the Majestic 12, for people who don't know, was introduced under... The Majestic 12 documents first appeared in 1984 in a film canister to to TV producer Jamie Chandray. And this included the Eisenhower briefing document and later the Special Operations Manual and then a whole host of other documents. And this details the Majestic 12, a supposed UFO crash retrieval and reverse engineering group spearheaded by Vannevar Bush, including including Roscoe Hillenkoetter, Dr. Donald Menzel, I think his name is, von Neumann,
Jerome Hunsaker, who else?
Denzel Ward,
Vandenberg,
yeah,
Hoyt Vandenberg. Yeah. Nathan Twining, a bunch of head honchos in military intelligence science.
And so, Majestic 12, Zodiac 12 signs. Some might suggest in the realm of UFO study that Zodiac is another name for Majestic 12, just like Majestic 12 has been called other names, like the Working Group, the PI-40 by that guy AH we talked about with Greer. So it's a super interesting story that I hope sees more coverage, because Richard Dolan has been a true trailblazer in the Zodiac story, and it's just kind of like the secret retrieval team. So to be quite plain, after talking with Ryan Wood, I think the Majestic 12 did exist in a capacity and probably still exists today, but I am hesitant to think about like a very ubiquitous crash retrieval team. I think that there's a very wide swath of retrieval teams and retrieval operations.
Well, there are people who I think are pretty credible who talk about this, like these continuity of government programs.
Yeah.
So the 5412 committee, national security, committee, back in the 50s and 60s, that turned into the 303 committee, which turned into the committee of 40. Do you have anything to say about that as far as their kind of, interest in UFOs?
Only thing I know is that Colonel John B. Alexander said that the Majestic 12 was specifically a continuity of government program.
Right.
But I hasten to adhere to what he says, because he lied about the Special Operations Manual.
He lied about a bunch of stuff.
Yeah,
and even in the Wilson memo, where the Wilson, of course, the Wilson
absolutely.
memo. So was it 1997?
1997 was when the Greer, Will Miller, Thomas Wilson, Stephen Lufkin meeting took place. The briefing took place.
Okay, interesting. But when was, and then
2002.
2002 is this meeting between Eric Davis, who's again this Hal Puthoff protege, propulsions expert, and like exotic physics expert. It's in the parking lot of EG&G, and he is meeting with Admiral Thomas Wilson, who's head of Joint Chiefs J2.
Yeah. He was like intelligence for JCS at the time.
So he should have like all exotic tech under his purview, and he's basically expressing extreme dissatisfaction that you had these rogue groups working on purportedly UFOs who he met with, and it's out of his jurisdiction. And in that document that I believe was found in the Edgar Mitchell estate, in that document, it says J.A. is a liar, and I think J.A. is John Alexander.
Yeah, because John Alexander has been publicly said, Majestic 12 exists, it had nothing to do with UFOs, and kind of all of that before. And of course, he kind of said mistruths about what Dr. Ryan Wood said about the Special Operations Manual. Ryan Wood and Robert Wood did a ton of provenance research on the Majestic documents, getting the physical onion skin documents, putting them through rigorous testing of materials.
So what do you think about these documents? Because they're popular view, like with those kind of old school like UFO researchers like Robert Hastings, who wrote UFOs and Nukes, is that this was passage material. So it was like meant to detect spies. It contained all sorts of falsities. You're giving it to this film producer who's friends with all these UFO researchers, Jamie Chandera. And then I think other versions of the Majestic 12 were then doled out in packages to other UFO researchers.
Because there's a whole host of documents, and the source cannot be all from the same person. And a bunch of varying quality documents. I tend to adhere to the work of Stanton Friedman, who spent a bunch of time authenticating these Special Operations Manual and Eisenhower briefing document with the Woods. I think those two probably have the strongest claims of real documents, as well as the two IPU, Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit reports. One of them is a 7-page report that sounds very similar to the Eisenhower briefing document and talks about the Roswell crash retrieval and so forth. Later on down the line, you get a lot of other documents like the burned memo and the Project Aquarius document from Lee Graham. The burned memo or the Project Aquarius, one of them, I can't remember which, actually makes reference to Project Zodiac, by the way, and like Project Jehovah and MK Ultra. But a lot of the earlier documents, like the Eisenhower briefing document, a lot of the dates and specific discussions line up with real events. For example, James Forrestal meeting with Truman, dates are mentioned when those two met and kind of discussed the future or the inception of Majestic 12 and so forth. If you look in the Library of Truman, Library of Eisenhower, when he's supposedly briefed, these presidents and president incumbents had these meetings. I believe
Dulles' diary recently came out, and it showed a meeting with him and Eisenhower or something, and that was like a real meeting. And his diary came out after the Majestic 12 documents obviously had come out, and they corroborated the information in the Majestic 12 documents. So it's probably similar to the Lazar stuff, where it's like some of the stuff is just true. Well, and then maybe true and under a different name, and maybe they were looking for spies and there was some passage material involved, but yeah, it is interesting.
And then there were other documents like the Cutler-Twining memo that is really difficult to dispute and so forth. I was actually reading on the plane over here different validation of Majestic documents, and there's just been a lot of mentions of Majestic documents before, even including I can't remember the general's name, but a 4-star general who was asked about the documents. He said they're real, or the Majestic 12 is real. I can't tell you any more than that, because I know that the Majestic 12 to many sort of hobbyists in this subject is nothing more than kind of conspiracy material, right? They just think Majestic 12 may, not true, just.
But if you were to simulate back then, if a UFO issue were a thing and we had exotic materials and we were in contact with, an extraterrestrial or interdimensional intelligence, you would need our best and brightest on it. Yeah. And if you look at that list of people, those would be the people on it.
Yeah.
Vannevar Bush would be heading it up.
And then, of course, Vannevar Bush is completely unconnected with Robert Sarbacher and Dr. Eric A. Walker, as also mentioned as the head of UFO
and those guys,
research.
That's right. And then you have Gordon Gray, who was also on the Majestic. Don Menzel, who admitted, he was super read in on a Navy, CIA, a bunch of, pretty classified info, and admitted as much, actually, to Kennedy. And Stanton Friedman actually writes about this, was sort of in charge of disinfo and debunking, which he was debunking a lot of you. And there's this amazing Swedish astronomer, Beatrice Villarreal, and she talks about Menzel having deleted all this astronomical information from 1953 and onwards from the Harvard Observatory. Yeah. And at the Harvard Undersea Observatory at the time, you had Robert Sarbacher. He was working there, and then I think James Conant was the president of Harvard, and he was the number 2 guy, the Manhattan Project at the time. So, I don't know. It's hard to say, but it sort of makes sense. It's directionally correct.
Yeah, and it's not unreasonable to think that the group evolved over time, changed names and so forth. I mean, you have in 1980. 7 or 86 or 87 when Eric Walker is asked by Steinman about the Majestic 12 and he gives the Don Quixote impersonation. You're chasing after windmills. It's impossible to chase after the Majestic 12. The Majestic documents were first delivered to Chandray and Friedman and so forth in 1984. That's when the first documents were actually kind of received but weren't given to a MUFON symposium until 87. But what's interesting is the documents were kind of mailed out in 84, and then if we look at the manuscript of Corso, it kind of seems like around 86 the Majestic 12 took on a new name, the UFO Working Group, and got new blood like Albert Stubblebine and some NSA people and some CIA people. So it's interesting to think how this group may have evolved over time, and possibly it changed its name to the Working Group because it was aware of the leaks at the time.
The whole history is fascinating. I think maybe one of the tip of the spear frontier longitudinal timeline assessments of all UFO oversight is this great article by Chris Sharp at the Liberation Times.
Oh yeah,
it's really interesting stuff, and there's some connections you've made between Woods Hole and some
Crane.
of the Crane exactly, and Randy Anderson's story. But I also just want to touch on he talks about how it was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was before the National Security Act, before the CIA was formed. They were sort of in charge of the initial UFO, custody. And I think we have a decent map of actually what occurred. So David Grush says that there's this magenta crash in Lombardy in Italy in 1933. Exactly. I've now made the connection through some people, this woman, Pippa Malmgren, who's amazing. She's really interested in the UFO thing, but she was actually special assistant to George W. Bush. She made it clear to me that James Jesus Angleton was the U.S. OSS person involved in Italy at the time. And so rumors are that you have this magenta crash, and then Mussolini goes to Hitler and says, "Is this yours?" to the Nazis.
Right.
And then they end up working together on it. And so this magenta crash ends up probably being worked on by the Nazis, which explains these Die Glocke, rumors, and Kamlerstab in sort of modern Czechoslovakia and Poland, where they're working on these flying saucers. You have tons of reports around this from Rudolf Schreiber, Richard Mita, a bunch of guys at the time, along with Paul Mellon and Alan Dulles. There's a story of Paul Mellon kind of spilling the beans to his grandson, who's alive now, John Warner IV, about standing over a UFO that can employ exotic flight principles in modern day Czechoslovakia.
Wow.
And so you kind of can come up with this thread of the Lombardy magenta crash happens. It goes to the Nazis. Maybe there's some custody where the Vatican is involved as
yeah,
well.
I've heard that from Grush.
I heard that from Grush. And then it goes over to the U.S. and then it's worked on at Wright Airfield. And you have all these Operation Overcast paperclip Nazi scientists who then, that's part of the rush to get the Nazi scientists, is to get the ones who are like that, this deep on like really exotic, flight principles and UFO stuff. We now know Hans Kammler himself, who was in charge of the blackest of the black Wunderwaffe programs for the Nazis, made his way to the U.S. And so you kind of have this somewhat consistent narrative of like what happened with this early UFO crash and how the U.S. started to get involved with this stuff. And all the guys who were involved in the early Marshall Plan and tech transfer programs, Kissinger was an Army counter-intel guy who was doing tech retrieval at the time. And you have other examples. You mentioned Forrestal. Forrestal, was as well, and he was Secretary of the Navy. So
he threw himself out of the naval hospital in Bethesda.
Yeah, exactly. Mid Sophocles poem.
And the Magenta case is so interesting because Mussolini thought it was a Nazi advanced craft or a British or American advanced craft when he had his own special investigation group, the RS-33, who was like really keen on the fact this wasn't human technology, and then likely worked with the Nazis.
Yeah, and apparently Marconi's grandson might
Yeah.
be like on the verge of saying something. You have this Pinotti, this Italian UFO researcher who's like really on that trail.
I'd love to hear of more of a description, because the only real description we have is from the RS-33, like a disc, and then Grush, like a lenticular shape. And that begs the question when we brought over Operation Paperclip scientists, so Nazi scientists, if there's kind of a collaboration in crash retrieval groups today. Even in 2023, you had a Canadian defense member or parliament member, Larry Maguire, who wrote to the head of Canadian Defense wanting to bring the Canadian people up to speed on UFO programs, because there was an active Five Eyes nation that was working together on material exploitation and so forth.
Well, there's a scientific principle called the Kawanda effect, and it involves stabilizing basically a saucer-like craft. And there's this guy, Henry Kawanda was this guy, he's a Romanian scientist. He has a patent on this from 1936. And I think at points he was in Vichy, France, but he basically was forced to work under the Nazis. And then he was taken to Wright-Patterson to work on Project Y, which was an extension of the Avrocar project, which is trying to get flying saucers to work. And then William Steinman connects this with Thomas Townsend Brown and his gravity experiments, where they were coordinating with Thomas Townsend Brown and wanted to see if the gravity stuff worked so they could incorporate it into these saucers or whatever that they had.
I wonder how much that collaboration takes place, because, in Grush's News Nation interview, he talks about like a multi-decade Cold War with our adversaries, we can assume is Russia and China. I think back to Jonathan Weygant's encounter in 97 in Peru. Once he sees the UFO, he's taken in by these guys in DOE's rain jackets. He's flown to a place on a CH-47, interrogated for days. When he's brought to this location, this like obscure military base, there's not only Americans there, but there's Chinese, there's Germans. And so who else is collaborating on these projects if there's a multi-decade Cold War?
Well, that's the Lazar rumor as well, which is that like Russians were at Area 51 too, and there was sort of this co-space program. And that was always, there's, SALT, this is even public, this is open source. In the SALT 1 negotiations, I think it's a 1971 treaty, we're talking about coordinating with the Russians on the UFO question, because we were worried that they'd mistake it for American acts of aggression. That's what Kennedy probably wanted to do as well. So maybe there is some sort of international space program around the UFO thing. I don't know.
Yeah, and then we look at, of course, there's a lot of drama about this, but the Immaculate Constellation report that talks about alien reproduction vehicles seen over Indo-PACOM, which is obviously Chinese territory,
right?
Of like equilateral triangles with three lights seen over Chinese territory of adversarial ARV.
Right.
So it's like clear there's similar programs going on. If we have similar triangles, what sort of collaboration is occurring?
It feels hard for me to believe that like the surface level geopolitics that we see is totally fake.
Yeah.
Like I do think we are, tensions are at an all-time high with China. But it is interesting. I think in the Lazar account, it's like the Russians started to get kicked out as like tensions rose around like the development of these ARVs. And so it brings up, it harkens back to this Carl Nell quote. Carl Nell, who was part of the UAP task force with David Grush, was also deputy CTO of Northrop Grumman, and believe was stationed at Wright-Patterson Airfield.
And he was also Army Futures Command.
Army Futures Command. And he says there's this sub-rosa secret conflict, arms race going on between us and other countries. It's been going on for decades.
Yeah, for feudalistic dominance. So that begs the question, is the ultimate pursuit mastery of ARV? Because with ARV might not just be the vehicle, but it might be any sort of weapon or technology that can be exploited as weaponry. Remember what Randy said when he was taken to Crane, that the technology was considered weaponry due to an electronic discharge during retrieval.
Well, if you think about what the Manhattan Project was, it was all about payload potency and magnitude. And it's like, how can you create a bigger bomb? And then at a certain point, when you're at the Tsar bomb level or whatever, you're at, 80 megatons plus. It doesn't matter. That's too big for any target. You have tons of Tsar bombs. It's like, it's, game over for the world. Yeah. At that point, it becomes, the second Manhattan Project becomes about payload delivery. And it becomes like, who can deliver this payload faster and stealthier? And, it was ICBMs, and then it was stealth fighters, and, and so it's a scary world. And I almost don't even love talking about UFOs in this context, because I think it's the sacred ontological metaphysical thing, which should really drive people.
About weapons,
But I do think that might be a reality driving some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think back to the 1988 Norton show as well, when Brad saw the pulsar craft with the 121 nuclear warheads. The guys were raving on about how this could destroy Russia in like 20 minutes, raving on about that. And then on the other side of the curtain, you have saucers that utilize zero-point energy systems that could drop a nuclear payload in a quarter of a second, or the zero-point energy systems can be harnessed to create more devastating effects than even nuclear warheads.
Given that this technology is probably a forcing function for extreme good or extreme evil. Yeah. Think about nuclear fusion. It could destroy the world, or it could save the world.
Well, that's what Witness Ed out of Edward said. Part of the reason he reached out to Greer is because zero-point energy systems were being harnessed and repressed.
Do you believe, because that is part of the Stephen Greer narrative, that like the lost century? Yeah. I'm not convinced that I believe that we displayed some local effects around over unity, free energy, lower energy nuclear reaction, whatever. But the idea that we have scalable free energy that we're hiding in, black compartments feels hard for me to believe, but I'm open. What do you think?
I'm not sure, because I don't understand the physics enough. Yeah, there's always a world in which these energy systems could be powering deep underground military bases, and we just don't know about it, that it's already employed on the system at large. But my knowledge is, we need to call up Missile Man and ask him his advice on this part, because I just don't know enough.
Yeah, no, totally. I can't say I'm a high conviction in any direction there. But how do you, what's the thrust, or what's the motivation for your research? Is it just like truth seeking, or do you have a hope for how this sort of UFO thing ends? Because it seems like we've crossed a Rubicon of late as far as people's acceptance of these things.
Yeah, but not enough. Yeah. I've just been interested in this subject all of my life. And my goal really is just the work. I would like to, in a responsible manner, help disclose UAP legacy programs and bring a larger truth about what the craft are, what not just what they look like, but where they're from, what they do, why they're here, and how the programs that study and exploit these technologies have been constructed. Because there's a lot of very dark things in that aspect, not only just the decades of secrecy, but also just the exploitation of possible sentient beings and technology that is not ours.
And an exploitation of humans?
Yeah, that's the contentious thing we talked about as well with Jake and kind of Michael in that testimony with the psionics, because we have historical testimony that these psionic assets used to summon craft are treated like crap, given drug cocktails and so forth to perform efficiently, and that could result in danger or death. And we also have Jake and the psionics team saying they take, quite a bit of pride in those actions. So there's a discrepancy there. And if there's people like being hurt or, being given drugs forcibly, that's bad. It's very bad.
It's definitely bad. Yeah, it's not cool. And then the idea too, where I don't feel like I have probably the most concrete and good orientation towards this. And it's something I struggle with, because it's like you cover some of this stuff and it just leads you into dark territory.
Yeah.
And it leads you into the territory of like, I want people to know that this stuff is real, that reality is more expanded than we, realize. But the only way to do that is to uncover some pretty gnarly, messed up truths around like how this stuff has become operationalized.
Yeah.
And the government's orientation towards this is how can this confer a tactical advantage for us? And I think the orientation should be, how can this beget more meaning for people and civil side infrastructure updates? And then great, if there are derivative technologies that allow us to protect the free world in a more effective way, of course, they should be funneled to like the right thing. But it feels like the impetus, like the sole impetus is weaponization of this stuff. And I don't think that ends well. If there's an intelligence on the other side of it, which I think there is, I don't think that ends well for us. If that's continues to be our orientation towards this topic, we're dealing with forces way greater than us. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, you know, OSAP and, you know, a lot of these programs, the people come out and they're kind of haunted. Yeah. They have these hitchhiker effects. I think it's sort of, you know, the two sort of mantras in UFO research world are like, seek and you shall find, and fuck around and find out.
Stare into the void, and it stares
back. Right back. And it's a mirror of what you feel. And people, the description of the sphere, often when people, you know, they're looking for this psionic connection between this participant and these materials. They're often, what's inside of them gets excavated and mirrored in this technology.
I mean, it's also very poignant, like looking at the testimony of Corso as well. He said that the purpose of giving this technology to U.S. industry was A, to bolster the U.S. war machine, and B, benefit the American people if necessary. These technologies clearly have not been used to benefit the American people, but if they're used to create, you know, alien reproduction vehicles, which I believe they are, and possibly service an unidentified space program, or you know, in near Earth orbit defense capabilities, or payload delivery, or human relocation, as Michael saw with the large football field-sized 8-gun craft, or operate underground and deep underground military bases, it's clear that that's a very disturbing reality in which we live. Because that's 80 years of programs, right, that have had time to flourish and hide themselves and like layer on themselves. That's a very frightening world.
It is a very frightening world. I just retweeted Scott Adams, you know, the Dilbert creator, and he said, you know, wherever there is complexity, there is fraud. And I just thought that was so applicable to the UFO question. There is an absurd amount of complexity to the point where disclosure has taken a quantum leap around this Jake Barber story and some of the other stories. And like mainstream media could not give less of a shit. No. They don't understand. And it was horrible timing around the inauguration, like peak news mania. And then that's when you release this thing that's beyond the pale for most people. And you're piecemealing in psionics and all these other things. And that's, and I love Ross Coulter. I think he's an amazing investigative reporter. And I think Jake is beyond reproach as well. So it's not a knock on either of them. It's a knock on the timing and maybe News Nation's editing team.
Yeah, but it's like for the 45-minute special, that had to be like on the editing team.
That was not good. And then everybody started to be vindicated when Ross did this amazing follow-up with Jake. That was awesome.
Minute. And then with, of course, I thought one of the most underappreciated testimonies was Don Paul Bales as well.
Oh, yeah.
Works closely with Jake. He talked very poignantly on retrieval and implications of crash retrieval. And so that started to kind of refocus the conversation with that, which with Fred Baker, with Dr. John Blitch.
Yep.
Yeah, but yeah, you're right. Mainstream media could not care less.
They can care less, and it's wild to see realities just diverge so starkly. Where it's like UFO world is on it's on another planet, literally.
And then there's also a big pickup in social media categories of kind of discrediting all the stories coming out and whistleblowers, so forth. Like I've even noticed a larger concentration of revisiting and kind of discrediting Grush as well, who I find beyond reproach. Almost probably more than anybody else.
Yeah, dude, that guy's like motivated by the right stuff.
Yeah,
he's pieced together so much.
Yeah,
and he's been treated like shit.
And I think his disclosure was done his disclosures were done in the greatest manner possible. Where if you have disclosures but can't necessarily provide firsthand evidence, he provided so much actionable intelligence.
Yes.
You know, whether to pursue IRAD contracts, IDIQ contracts, embedding of programs, history of programs, certain retrieval incidents, Malmstrom Air Force Base incidents. He provided so much actionable intelligence.
Hundreds of documents, I think maybe 1,000 pages plus to the IC Inspector General, Thomas Meinheim, who's now out, and they've haven't done anything about it.
Nothing.
And unless you can look at those documents, and all we have is that Thomas Mannheim said it was urgent and credible, and nobody has debunked anything in those documents. So unless you can debunk stuff in those documents, then you need to take action on what this guy is saying. It's absurd.
The only knocks people have against Grush is the Ken Klipstein hit piece, or the fact his op-ed didn't come out.
Where Ken Klipstein, basically Klippenstein, he admitted to Cigar and Crystal and Cigar, the breaking points.
Yeah.
You know, guys, he admitted that like the DOD and IC like tipped him off on the story, basically.
Yeah.
So it's just crazy. Like, and then the USAID, we now know, was funding the intercept. I don't know how much of that specifically made its way to Ken Klippenstein, but like, and the dude has all these like secret sources from the USAID. So he's a bad faith actor. I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
And I made a tweet to that effect, and I got somebody threatened to sue me, and I'm not going to say their name because I don't want to amplify them. They're really bad actors. And they've also questioned the service records of, Randy Anderson and Jake Barber, which is just, I think, disgusting, to be honest. Like, don't go after that, There
was a lot of talk about like the combat controller pipeline, even though that Jake has said numerous times he was in the pipeline for combat controller, but then was diverted elsewhere.
These guys just, and one of them specifically has a clearance, and it's like, I don't know what he's up to. I don't know if he's actually acting like he wants to be a paid disinfo agent, but he hasn't gotten the contract yet, and he's actually just like this small-time guy.
I think part of this is as well, there's like some popularity to go against kind of the disclosure movement, and there's like a couple like prominent channels that really base their entire entire fame off of just debunking everything, like almost pre-debunking stuff. Like a teaser of Jake Barber would come out, and they'd already be debunking stuff.
Totally. And they don't listen to any of the details, and their priors are entirely off because they take nothing seriously. So it's their Occam's razor is it's all mass hysteria, which if you look at the levels of government that are now saying that this is real, your Occam's razor, this is like a cabal controlling all these people. It's the greatest mass hysteria in the history of, it's the best psyop in the world by standard deviations, if that's your claim, which is itself a fantastical null hypothesis. So these people they suck, honestly.
The cabal stuff is nonsense because it's all talked about in the frame of ATIP and OSAP, which, as we've talked about throughout this whole conversation, there's going back to Robert Sarbacher in 1950 and even before in 1933 with Mussolini. There are so many other players involved. There might be a lot of reoccurring players that we've also talked about as well in recent disclosures, but the circular reporting, this crash retrieval and reverse engineering is not isolated to a small group of people.
No, it's not at all. If anything, the intelligence community tactic to kind of repress this stuff has been flood the zone.
Yeah.
So there's just too much snake oil to sift through for the average person. I think it moved from secrecy under Blue Book in the 50s and 60s, and then the 80s at some point around the Majestic 12 stuff. This stuff started to get promoted, but with all sorts of quackery. And you have Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent and other counter intel people like Rick Doty being like, there are 6 alien beings, and like John Lear saying, there's a soul catcher on the moon. Or
and
whatever.
That's starting to pop back up with some of Rick Doty's disciples, like the guy I think who's in prison, who tweets all the time, like, let me show you a photo of an extraterrestrial, and it'll just be a random image.
Right.
And so forth. So that's starting to pop back up.
Yeah, so that it's just, I don't know. I'd love to, because I think earnest debate is always good. And Mick West, people say he's like a paid asset or whatever. I enjoyed like having him on to debate Merrick, and we debated all the top UFO videos, and I thought that was like fun and good. And he doesn't seem like, he's like, I want more light shown on this. I think he could be a little more like earnestly open to some of this stuff, but like, some of these other guys are just like bad vibes, and like it's all ad hominem, and it's they threaten lawfare and stuff, and it's whack. It's like I hope you I don't know, just introspect a little bit if I mean, again, read between the lines and see if this applies to you, because I don't want to mention anybody, but it's like, just think about like what you're doing. Like, are you really on the right side of history?
Well, also step back and study the subject a little more, because even if you're not ready to make the jump into crash retrievals and reverse engineering yet, go back, look at the history of Sign, Grudge, Blue Book, OSAP. Go look at numerous sightings, mass sightings. Just go through a long list of UFO sightings and projects in the 20th century.
Yep.
And start there. I mean, there's not the Condon Committee, but the Condon report from England, Project Magnet, Project Second Story, Grudge, Sign, Blue Book, all sorts of UFO programs around the world, numerous sightings, private corporations contracted to look at UFOs, and Battelle.
Well, go watch your channel too, UAPGerb, because it's like I said, it's literally a fire hose. It's a cannon of like absurd amounts of information to the point where you can't just dismiss it all. There's something going on. Even if that something is slightly adjacent to the consensus truth we all think on aliens, UFOs, maybe the rest of the iceberg doesn't look like the tip of the iceberg, that's fine. I don't think anybody on the pro-UFO side is dogmatic about that. I think it's just this stuff is worthy of investigation, which clearly it is.
And if you're still just trying to figure out, do UFOs exist, just go look at all the dang military reports of pilots and so forth citing UFOs. Like the Malmstrom case, people dismiss that, but that's a great one to study. Minot Air Force Base, in which I think a B-2 bomber encountered a saucer flying around it, de-elevating. There's so many stories. Just go read through the Blue Book files of the unexplained cases.
Yeah. No, they're an enormous amount, and anybody in the government capacity looking at this sort of, earnestly always comes to the same conclusion, which is there's something probably here.
Yeah, as Eric Davis says, there's a there.
Clearly. Well, Sammy, UAPGerb, this has been an absolute honor. Is there anything else you wanted to cover? I mean, there are probably 100 other things you could talk about, but
yeah, nothing really. There's so much stuff we could talk about. I just say to everybody, keep investigating crash retrievals and reverse engineering. There's a ton of interesting cases and interesting studies and corporations and military requirements, and send out FOIA requests as well. A no answer and a denial is always an answer within itself.
We didn't even get to that story of the whistleblower who talked about, was it an egg-shaped craft like off on the Azores, like off of Portugal?
Oh, yeah. We'll save that because I plan to talk to that guy soon. But it's a person who was stationed with the USAF who claimed to see a Tic Tac.
A Tic Tac, that's right.
Unloaded from a C-130 Hercules.
Yep.
And there's a lot of good research there as well.
That C-130s are often transport, or what do you mean good research? Just that this incident?
Yeah, because of course this guy, when I studied this case, he doesn't have photos or reports on the actual craft, but the information he can share, which is like the insignia on the C-130 and on the nearby vans, just even just the C-130 that unloads the Tic Tac, and knowing what military wing that's from can lead to such bountiful research, because then you can look where the C-130 is from, you can look at nearby contractors, you can look at nearby air wings, you can look at nearby FFRDCs and start to piece together some interesting stuff based off the testimony.
I love it, man. Well, go subscribe to UAPGerb. Check out, you're doing a follow-up with Randy Anderson. It'll probably be out or around when we put this out. And I know you're going to do an amazing job there, and you're not only going to talk to him, corroborate his story, but also, or try to stress test it, whatever. But also go really deep into, the specific contractor, SAIC, which was likely involved in this sort of, psychotronic or psionic research. It's been an honor, Sammy. Really appreciate you stopping by, man.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.